Thank you all for coming. I'm Bob Levenson, Director of IPSR and co-host with Lis Nielsen of this day. And looking around the room, I believe this is the most stellar gathering of people who are doing aging research by far that I've ever been, had the pleasure to be in, and some of the most interesting thinkers in the field, and from both sides of the pond, and from both sides of the midlife crisis, and so we're really looking forward to this day. And of course, the problem is when you get so many smart and interesting people together to deal with such an interesting topic. How do you set up the day so that it's not just the usual stuff? And I think we've decided to do two things. One is we're kind of featuring short talks, much shorter than usual, and trying to have opportunity for discussion. And we've encouraged the speakers to talk about not the old story, but the things that they're really interested and exciting about. No, that's nothing to worry about. Including the things that they don't understand yet. So, and we want to encourage you to enter in this day in that spirit, that it's really a gathering of the people who are interested in this research area, and NIA is very interested in, as you'll see in a second, really three kind of future-oriented things that they would like to see come out of this meeting. So I think the big challenge for us, in addition to being so stuffed into this little room, is, and I have to say something about Liz. She walked in yesterday and she said, wow, I feel like I'm in East Germany. Yeah, right, yeah, central planning. And I said, yes, we won an award in the 50s when this was built. But in a way, I think that maybe great ideas will come out of this. We have plenty of food, so you won't be hungry, but there will be a little bit of crowding. So we wanted to start by just quickly going around and asking everybody to say their names and their universities and or their institutions, and maybe just the two-word version of what you study. So I'm Bob Levenson. I'm going to give you an example. UC Berkeley, and I study emotion and aging. Louise, you want to?
I'm Louise Phillips from the University of Aberdeen, and I guess I also study emotion and aging.
Everybody does. That's why I'm so excited. Yeah.
Isaacowitz from Brandeis University, and I'm going to go with them. I also study emotion and aging.
Fredda Blanchard-Fields, Georgia Institute of Technology, Social Cognition and Emotion and Aging.
Can I just stop for a second? Could people in the back hear when we use our regular? Some can and some cannot. So
use your outside voice.
We'll have a microphone for the talks, but let's project, because a lot of the discussion that might be around the table, we want to be sure everybody can hear.
I'm Michael Lamb, University of Cambridge, episodic memory in children and children's adjustment.
I'm Sonia Lubomirsky from University of California, Riverside. I study happiness.
Laura Kobzanski from the Harvard School of Public Health, and I study social disparities, stress, emotion, and health.
Louise Hockley from the University of Chicago, study social relationships, loneliness, health, and the aging process.
Hi, I'm Natalie Denberg from the University of Iowa, and I'm interested in real-world decision-making in older adults.
I'm Mara Mather from the University of Southern California, and I study emotion, cognition, interactions, and aging.
I'm Jonelle Strauch from West Virginia University, and I study everyday problem solving and decision making in early and later adulthood.
I'm Dave Savara from the University of Arizona, and I study social disruption.
Shelley Taylor, University of California, Los Angeles. I study social relationships and psychosocial resources. Now they protect health across the lifespan.
I'm Laura Carstensen. I study emotion, motivation, and the effects on cognition and aging.
Steve Manuck, University of Pittsburgh, study psychosocial risk factors for heart disease.
Richard Suzman from the NIA. I'm too undisciplined to study anything, but I once did actually apply here for graduate school.
Sherry and I are still reviewing this around, it might find me. Yeah, so you're really looking good. Don't
as they said,
guarded optimism.
And then I can finally begin.
I'm Lis Nielsen, also from the National Institute on Aging, and I also once applied here to graduate school. Okay.
Yeah, Sarah, sorry.
I'm Sarah Hawley, and I am in graduate school here.
Sarah's writing is our science writer for the meeting, and she'll be writing the final report.
My name's Ben Cedar, and I'm a graduate student here as well.
And Ben is one of the hosts today and staff who, if you have any problems, he'll be helping you with AV all day.
I'm Oliver John. I'm a professor here in the psychology department at Berkeley. I study personality, self, and emotion regulation.
Good morning, I'm Jen Lerner, and I'm at Harvard University. I study emotion effects on judgment and decision making, and I once was a graduate student there.
I'm Jason Mitchell. I am in the psychology department at Harvard, and I study the self and theory of mind.
I'm Amy Pollack. I'm the Director of Government Relations at the Association for Psychological Science.
I'm Madeline McKine. I'm a graduate student also at Boston. I'm Jocelyn Z, also a graduate student in Boston, studying empathy-related processes and aging.
I'm Kat Norris. I'm in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at Dartmouth College, and I study basic emotional processes.
I'm Neil Ram at Penn State and do within-person variability and change.
I'm Jim Cohn in the Department of Psychology at the University of Virginia, and I study socially mediated emotion regulation.
I'm Heather Urry. I'm at Tufts University in the Boston area, and I study emotion regulation and aging.
I'm Jennifer Beer. I'm at UT Austin, and I study social neuroscience.
And you used to.
And I applied for undergrad, grad, and postdoc here.
I'm James Gross from Stanford. I'm interested in emotion regulation and was a grad student here.
I'm Sherry Johnson. I'm in the psychology department here, and my work focuses on risk factors for mood disorders.
I'm Wayne Mendes. I'm at Harvard University, and I study how emotions are embodied across a lifespan.
I'm Howie Rosen. I'm a neurologist at UCSF. I study dementia and aging and motion and self-processing in that context a little bit.
I'm Joseph Michaels from Cornell University, and I study emotion, cognition, interactions, and aging.
I'm Valerie Reyna, also from Cornell University, and I study memory, judgment, and decision-making, especially risky decision-making.
I'm Mike Shore. I'm an experimental economist from Vanderbilt, and I study empirical decision-making.
I'm Susan Fisk, Princeton University. I do social cognition and social neuroscience.
I'm Lonnie Sciotta. I'm in the Department of Psychology at Arizona State, some of my colleagues here. I study positive emotion, emotion regulation, and aging, and I also was a grad student here.
I'm Rosie Suze. I'm with the NIA. I work in the Behavioral and Social Research Division as a program analyst.
Rosie was one of the big liaisons in this project, and you probably saw our three names on a lot of more emails than you were expecting.
And she has 10 R01s to hand out.
I'm Margaret Kennedy at the University of California, San Francisco, and I study social processes and hormones of the immune system.
I'm Mary Davis. I'm at Arizona State University, and I study social relationships and coping with the health challenges of aging.
I'm Anthony Ong. I'm at Cornell University, and I study stress, positive emotions, and health.
I'm Alexandra, Arizona State University, and I study resilience.
I'm Bob Waldinger. I'm from Harvard Medical School, and I study health and emotion regulation and aging.
And I'm Mary Gilhooly. I'm the Executive Director of the Brunel Institute for Aging Studies in the west of London. I'm a true generalist. I study incontinence, food and the maintenance of identity, and at the moment I also have a grant on decision making in everyday life. There are lots of other topics.
I'm Suzanne Segerstrom. I'm in the Department of Psychology at University of Kentucky, and I study self-regulation and physiology.
I'm Ming Xu from University of Illinois, and I study economics and neuroscience.
I'm Eli Pederman, and I'm working with Alyssa Apple. I'm studying emotions, motivation, and their influence on health behavior.
Liz, we didn't get you.
Oh, I'm Liz Asher. I'm a grad student in Bob's lab. I study emotion and dementia. While I have the floor, I'm also helping out today, and you all have consent forms in your folders. Please sign them and give them to either me, Elizabeth Peel, or Michelle out here. Thank you. Oh, sorry. All speakers have consent forms in their folders. That didn't mean
I'm Louise Phillips. I'm at the University of Washington. I study self-regulation from age 4 to 45, and are subject to rapidly getting older.
I'm Karina Lockenhoff. I'm at Cornell University, and I study age-related changes in personality and emotion, and their influence on health-related decisions and behaviors.
I'm Iris Mouse at the University of Denver, and I study emotions and emotion regulation.
I'm Elliot Friedman at the University of Wisconsin. I study social and psychological predictors of biological indices of health and aging.
I'm Will Cunningham. I'm at Ohio State University and I study affective neuroscience.
I'm Brent Mosbach from the University of California, San Diego. I study chronic stress, coping, and biomarkers for cardiovascular disease.
Hi, I'm Aoife Donovan. I'm from UCSF, and I'm studying the effects of depression and anxiety on biological aging.
I'm Dylan Smith, University of Michigan. I study measurement as it relates to emotions and quality of life.
Alyssa. I'm Lis Ethel. I study stress, obesity, and aging, and I'm at UCSF. I'm a psychiatry.
You miss anybody else? Alan is going to be doing the videography today, and those of you who are speakers will have a little consent form, and this will be on YouTube tonight and on the Daily Show. So this will be great. A couple of other little housekeeping details. If you want to plug in, there are a ton of outlet strips on the floor. If you look in your folders, there's information on connecting up to the wireless. Everybody has a password for the day. And if you need to plug into a router, grab Ben or Liz, and they'll take you somewhere where you can connect up that way. One other thing, the reason everybody up in the front studies emotion is because we sorted people that way. We'll resort at each break so that the front table is the panel. So those of you who are speakers, don't make permanent electrical connections because you'll be moving around during the day. And I think that's all I have to say. Liz?
Yeah, I want to make some introductory remarks. I have slides and it doesn't matter very much. I just wanted to give you guys a bit of a background for the workshop and some things about what BSR, the Behavioral and Social Research Division at NIA, is interested in, and why this workshop fits into our vision, and highlight some of the goals that we have for what we want to do over this day. So as by way of background, last year at APS we held a workshop that was very didactic on entering into aging research. Some of you were there. It was really a sort of a grand tour through real highlights of very accomplished aging researchers, as well as information on getting grants from the NIA. People enjoyed that meeting but wanted something more in depth, and we see this as an extension of that, and its continuation of exposing people to what's going on in aging research and giving people a better chance to see and tackle with some of the scientific questions. We've also been holding a series of related meetings topically to this one, including workshops on neuroeconomics and social neuroscience of aging, workshops on allostatic load, stress aging, the brain and the body, incorporating areas of health psychology and neuroscience. And last summer we had a meeting with our sister institution, the Economic and Social Research Council in the UK, sort of bridging laboratory and survey research to tackle questions about social and economic behavior and aging with a focus on social neuroscience. And so we have representatives from that meeting, Michael Lamb, Louise Phillips, and Mary Gilhooly, who were there also to help continue those discussions. In our division, we have a number of areas of emphasis that really span our portfolios in psychology, economics, demography, sociology, and related fields, including these that you see here. And I think in every case, whether we're talking about health disparities due to racial ethnic differences or socioeconomic differences or gender, whether we're looking at changes in aging minds, whether we're looking at the ways genetics and behavior and the social environment interact, or understanding the burden of illness. Psychology has something to bring to bear on all of these questions. The themes that cut across our entire division are looking at aging as a process from birth to death. So we encourage taking a life course perspective, and so for those of you who don't know this, NIA is not only the place where studies of older adults happen, but we're interested in processes over the life course, understanding all phases of adulthood, also early life influences on later life outcomes. We're very interested in biobehavioral linkages and collaborate with our other NIA programs in neuroscience, biology, and clinical practice. And we're very focused also on looking at multi-level interactions among the psychological, physiological, social, and cultural levels. We like to see efforts to develop improved methodologies and measurement for all of these domains that we study, and especially are interested in encouraging the translation and application of the findings in the basic sciences to some of these critical questions of aging. I want to mention that last year, every 4 years our division is reviewed, and last year we had our review with Alan Garber from Stanford and John Cacioppo from the University of Chicago, former council members, as our co-chair. And a number of subcommittees were convened to discuss our current directions and future needs in areas such as social neuroscience and neuroeconomic psychology of aging, and some of the other ones that you see listed here. Broad recommendations that came out of this review were to continue to emphasize and strengthen our emphasis on integrative science and multi-level analyses, to promote the studies that look at things from issues of aging from a life course perspective, to encourage the team science that's needed to advance these kinds of agendas, and also promote new training opportunities, not standard training programs that we do have and are glad for at institutions looking at aging in various domains, but new opportunities like what we have convened here today for people to be exposed to the work going on in aging from other disciplines, and also to bring new people into the aging field. The key recommendation was that the research that NIA should be supporting needs to incorporate analyses that integrate multiple levels of inquiry, ranging from genes to biomarkers to neural systems to behaviors. And these types of projects are going to be critical for elucidating the pathways that link our social behaviors and social environments to age-related outcomes. And ultimately, those findings will be critical for informing the interventions that we would like to support to improve the lives of older people. From our Psychology of Aging panel, the point that really came through was that the most innovative research that's going on in psychology crosses the traditional silos or subdisciplines within the field. People are focusing on the ways the environment interacts with social, emotional, and cognitive factors to impact how people are living their lives, responding to decisions, to stressors, to maintaining relationships, to regulating their emotions, and how these different efforts affect people's physical health. So that the best research that's undertaking these kinds of analyses is really taking this multi-level approach. And I think we have a nice array of representations of people who are doing that kind of work here, both in the audience and speakers that will be coming up. Some of the needs that were identified were a greater need for studies that help to improve adaptive functioning of individuals in their daily environments, and to identify the causal mechanisms that contribute to their resilience. And so the focus of this meeting really is to try to engage you all in a dialogue about what constitutes adaptive or healthy aging, and how the basic science that we're all engaged in can contribute to understanding and improving people's lives, broadening our conception of health from this idea of being free of disease and disability to a conception that includes well-being and thriving and living well in your environment. We're also very encouraged to provide the infrastructure and support for efforts that will support both large-scale research as well as innovative training to advance this goal. In social neuroscience and neuroeconomics, a lot of NIA's focus to date has been on decision-making areas, an area where we had strength because of our links between our economics program and our psychology program. But a greater emphasis could be placed on the role of social relationships and emotional reasoning and regulation on influencing social behaviors, decision-making, and health. Very often in our work in basic emotion research and aging, we sort of have a promissory note at the end of our papers saying, and what we're finding here could be useful to inform how people make decisions in health and social domains. And I think we really want to push that envelope there and talk about how can what we're doing and talking about today really help change people's lives. We're interested very much in incorporating genetic approaches, including the ways that genetic expression or age-related changes in the nervous system affect a lot of the social and economic behaviors that we're talking about. And we're also very interested in integrating social neuroscience and neuroeconomics or basic psychology or behavioral economics with behavioral intervention research to really improve our understanding of how the way people are incentivized in their environments influences the choices that they make, the health behaviors that they engage in, and their health outcomes and well-being in the long term. So we have a number of initiatives that we are ongoing. I mean, we haven't been unaware of these needs. We're trying to really promote a lot of these areas that I've listed up here. But the point of today's workshop is really to bring together researchers, some who are relatively new to aging, with leaders in psychology of aging and related fields, to encourage some greater focus on these issues of relevance to the NIA mission, and to continue and advance dialogues that have been begun at recent meetings over the past couple of years. Our main hope is that we'll address these three topics over this day. We'd like to encourage consideration of how to advance the study of adaptive and healthy aging using the integrative approaches you'll see represented here that bridge psychology and other disciplines. We want to encourage crosstalk, and we have a time allotted for, we hope, fruitful discussion between scientists who are studying social and emotional function in our morning panel, and those who are studying psychological and biological processes in health in our next panel, and our afternoon panel who are studying decision-making, so that we can see what these different fields can offer to one another to advance these goals. And we'd also like to encourage people within each of those domains to identify the key opportunities and needs for advancing the science within their specific area, with an eye to thinking how it will help this kind of translation. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Richard Suzman, and who wants to say a few words to you as well. We look forward to the day.
Well, that was the rational cognitive. Now here's the emotion. Well, looking at the audience, you know, I see both some people I know and a lot of summary statements I know. But I think one emotion or reaction I have is that the density of people I'd like to see funded or funded more is very, very high, higher than in most meetings I talk to. So congratulations, Liz, Bob, and the rest of the Berkeley contingent for organizing this meeting. There were some earlier antecedents to the meeting. Part of some of the ideas started off with a summer institute that we run at RAND called, it's both a mini med school which provides basic biology, genetics, and clinical medicine, so you know where the liver is and things like that, for social behavioral scientists. But there are also two, 3 days of didactic research presentations of some of the best people in the field. And we set that up because maybe 15 years ago, it's got the 15th anniversary coming up in July, and there's still room for people who want to attend. The training programs we had, certainly in demography and economics, were very fragmented and partial. And to give people a much broader perspective, we thought it'd be useful to collect graduate students and junior faculty together and give them some and present some master lectures. There was also the idea that I think is driving us, and that is of the Gordon conferences. Now, I've never been to a Gordon conference, but I have an idea of what goes on or what should go on, and I'd like to somehow repeat that, and that's getting the leading people at the leading edges of several fields together to sort of spend 2 or 3 days talking and lecturing without attribution to sort of move the field further. And I think a couple of people like Alan Kraut and John Cacioppo and Bob came down to the RAND meetings, and the idea was to set up something somewhat similar to that, and this is an outgrowth of this, and I'd like to see something more permanent, annual, going on over a few days in a nice location. I think that's important. And this is a nice location, but in Stalinist architecture aside, well, you haven't seen the Humphrey. If you have seen the Humphrey building, head of for the Department of HHS, you should. But that's one of the things I'd like to go. I think another component of this is that we've been also supporting a series of workshops and publications at the National Academy of Science. And some years ago, when I became the associate director for this area, I think I managed to insult a fair fraction of the community by saying that I thought that some of the areas in psychology that we'd been funding, especially around personality and social psychology, were rather dull and needed to be souped up and made more interesting and more lively, and to become more integrated with other parts of what was going on in other fields. To kind of save the day and recoup some goodwill, we set up a panel at the National Academy of Science that Laura chaired, and I think helped rescue that panel, and it turned into a very fine volume, When I'm 64, and there'll be more like that. Now, a couple of points that just to say a few things that Liz said in a slightly different way. I think BSR is relatively unique, although many, I think, are beginning to copy us, in that we really want to see vertical integration going from basic to applied, and I think we need a lot more basic research. I think having the applied component is quite useful. There's a book by Don Stokes called Pasteur's Quadrant, in which he argues that having to apply some things, as Pasteur did, can actually drive basic science in some important ways. And there are a lot of other disciplines that we're able to combine and recombine within BSR that are customers for some of what you do at some point. They're the demographers, the sociologists, the economists, the epidemiologists, and I think it's just useful having a demand for your project and trying it out in practice to move forward the more basic, which is some of the most interesting. So we've got depth and we've got breadth, and that's important. I think there's another component to what we do, and that is we rather like, or I do, failure, because, and I think we don't have enough failure in what we fund, because failure sometimes means high-risk stuff. We like to see risky stuff. We also like subversive science that will break down and destroy old paradigms or help develop new ones. So that's what really grabs us in many ways. In terms of aging, I have fought since I've been at NIA against what I see as the Gero police. The people who are trying to constrain the field to a much narrower vision than I think what we have and what, for example, some of my predecessors had, such as Matilda Riley. The point is that often things we have seen as relevant to understanding either the older population or as aging has not been seen by the people who narrowly and strongly identified with the field as being relevant, but it's turned out to be relevant quite often. And so I think we have a very broad Catholic perspective of relevancy and of what's importance. And so the critical thing is to be able to show and to have a reasonable story for why this might be relevant. That's for us, although getting through review is another matter. There are one component that Liz never mentioned is that we do support a fair number, in fact a very large number, of longitudinal studies, some of which were started by psychologists and are mainly psychology, but increasingly they are multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary. There's some very large ones, such as the Health and Retirement Study, MIDAS, the English Longitudinal Study on Aging, a new one beginning on following up the old National Long-Term Care Survey. But many of these have significant components of cognitive measurement, personality measurement, and increasingly are collecting DNA and maybe not telomeres, but we're beginning to discuss doing GWAS, genome-wide association studies on and sequencing on the data. And I think there is really a new age dawning of how we're going to integrate the genetic information in those large national longitudinal populations with thousands of covariates into the behavioral model. Finally, I think we can, Liz, at some point you should talk about some of the upcoming RFAs. At one level, they have to be very confidential until they're published in some matters to keep the playing field even. But once we have presented a concept to our council and it's been approved in public session, we are able to tell you to get ready for the RFAs. So there is one coming for small networks. There is going to be one on behavioral economics, which is in many ways, which is really psychology. It was two of the three people who started it were psychologists, who developed behavioral economics were psychologists, are psychologists. But that's behavioral economics as applied to changing health behaviors, lifestyles. And then there's another one coming on that will deal with the integration of longitudinal studies, especially twin and family studies, to be directed towards the integration of genetic analyses within those studies and the creation and coordination of a common outcome of behavioral phenotypes so that multiple studies can be coordinated. The last point I'd make is one that I mentioned these studies, these longitudinal studies, because one of the things we're also trying to do that I think would be of value is to bring the field and the lab closer together and have much more interaction between them, which I think is also going to happen in other ways in larger areas surrounding the comparative effectiveness research, for which NIH has received $400 million and is going to continue. But there's going to be, I think, increasing integration between observational studies, what I call social astronomy, and and interventions. Finally, let me say that many of you have all been very aware of the stimulus funds that NIH got, which is a wonderful opportunity that we were entrusted by the administration with these funds. It's really put every behavioral scientist to work writing challenge and go grants, but there are so many of them that have come in. I think there are 20,000 challenge grants that have come in. But one of the things that we did with some of the other stimulus funds we got was that we funded almost all of the applications that we could between our funding line, which is around 11.6% percentile, and the 20th percentile, except for foreign applications and ones that couldn't do anything in 2 years. So that big overhang has been cleared up, and now is a really great time to put in application, R01 applications, R21 applications, because everyone else who put in those challenge or go grants can't put those in until they're reviewed, and there's a window of opportunity. So now's the time.
All right. I'm going to act as timekeeper, and I'll signal speakers along the way, and the goal is to leave some time at the end for questions. Dan, let's make sure we have the sound on for the speakers. So our first panel is on fundamental social and affective processes in aging, and we are delighted to have Laura Carstensen as our lead-off speaker. As you know, this was pretty much a dormant area of research until her theoretical work and empirical work sort of lit the candle on this area, and it's really thriving now. And having heard her speak in the last month, I know she's also doing a lot of thinking about how this work applies to the kind of the way we accommodate these changes that occur within our aging population. So, Laura Carstensen. Oh, why isn't aging depressing?
Yeah. Thanks, Bob.
Not a remote, but you can clip that. And then yeah. Oh, and then just use it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And you know, it really is exciting. It was great for me to listen to the names of the people in this room and the universities that are represented in Europe and the United States. This field really is getting very exciting because of people like you contributing to it. It seems that emotion doesn't follow the same downward trajectory that cognitive and physical aging follow. And because the study of emotion came relatively late, I think researchers, when they initially started in this area, just assumed that the emotion system would be deteriorating like everything else. And it turns out that that's not true. There may be aspects, there's certainly, you know, a nuanced kind of an area. It's not that everything is great. But it would be wrong to say that aging leads to depression or even unhappiness, that it doesn't seem to be the case. And in fact, there's some evidence that it's quite the opposite. If we consider the oldest people who have ever lived, Jean-Louis Calment, many of you know, was the oldest woman in the world when she died at the age of 122. She was, you know, she's sort of longevity's reigning champ. She was just wonderful in her later years. I mean, she played herself in the movie Vincent and Me, making her the oldest actress that ever lived. But there are all these wonderful stories about her and her sense of humor. She was asked at the age of 120 what sort of a future she anticipated, and she remarked, a very short one. My favorite story about Como is a story where that there was a lawyer who tried to buy her house from her when she was about 90. She had this lovely house in the country in France, and she wouldn't sell. She really loved the home, and she said she wasn't going to sell. She was going to keep it till she died. And so he made this deal. He said, okay, I'll pay you $400 a month for the rest of your life if you will sell the house or bequeath the house to me on your death. And so she said, okay. She agreed to that. And she outlived him by 2 years. He died at the age of 77, and he went to her 120th birthday party, and at the party she is said to have remarked to him, sometimes people make very bad deals. John Wilmoth, who is a demographer here at Berkeley, introduced me to the oldest man ever documented. When he was 115 years old, he lived to 118. And I went with him to San Rafael to a nursing home to interview him, and it was really fun in lots of different ways. But at one point toward the end of the conversation, I said to him, what makes you happy? And he said, after this long delay, because he was nearly deaf and he had these earphones and so on, his working memory must have been really quite something to have such a long delay before a reply. But I wait, and then he says, being around people who are happy. And I said to him, and what makes you sad these days? And he replied, after what seemed like 10 minutes, what's there to be sad about? Pretty profound. So these two people, of course, aren't representative of all older people, obviously. But if you look at longitudinal data that shows the trajectory of emotional experience, that looks pretty positive too. This is a longitudinal project that Neelam Ram and I and others have been working on for about 10 years. What you see here are growth curves for people, and this is basically positive minus negative experience. So you're seeing the balance of emotion appear to be improving until the very end of life. And this is a reliable finding too, cross-sectionally and longitudinally, where you see this slight downturn. But at no point does that downturn return to the levels that you see in early life. It's quite clear in emotion research that the earliest years are the toughest years emotionally. So those in your 20s and 30s know that this is not the best time in your life. Many people have then started to talk about these kinds of findings as a paradox of aging. How can it be, given so much that does go wrong, and it does, can it be that older people are doing as well as they are? The theory that my group has worked from for many years now is called socio-emotional selectivity theory. It's a theory of motivation, and it's really grounded in the uniquely human ability to monitor time, not just clock time and calendar time, but lifetime, so that people know when they're coming closer to the end of life. Because goals are always set in temporal context, we argue that goals change in systematic ways, not because of aging so much per se, but because time is becoming shorter, or time horizons are becoming shorter and time is more constrained. We argue that when time is open-ended, as it typically is perceived in youth, that people are in a motivational set, if you will, to gather information, to bank information, to expand horizons, learn new things. Everything's interesting. People are interesting and take risks. But that as time horizons become more constrained, people shift to a focus on the present, pursue goals that can be realized in the present, and under those conditions, how one feels at the moment becomes important and takes priority. So we argue that emotion is being well maintained in part because more resources are being afforded to the regulation of emotion. How people feel is a priority, and so people make a greater effort in those areas. So you could think of it in a sense as chronically activated goals shift across the lifespan, from ones that are about gathering and expanding to ones that are focused and about meaning and well-being. So that's how we're thinking about this. It's called selectivity theory, and that we really believe that selection is the key here. People are selecting, selecting, selecting. They're selecting socially, they're selecting cognitively, they're selectively remembering things, and that's all, we believe, aimed at regulating emotion states. The literature on social networks shows that social networks become smaller with age. caused a lot of alarm early on, but it looks like those social networks are being selectively pruned and eliminating the most peripheral, non-meaningful relationships, but the core set of close emotional relationships seems to be maintained to 90s and 100s. So in some ways, social relationships become more emotionally supportive. It's the best ones are remaining and other ones are being discarded. Emotional experience seems to be better with age. That is, people are better at regulating conflict. Research that Bob Levenson and John Gottman and I did on marriages, where we had older and younger couples come into the laboratory and talk about conflicts, showed us that older people tried to talk around the conflicts. There weren't as many conflicts. It was really hard to get them to identify any at all to begin with. And they would, in the middle of discussing something rather heated, throw in a comment like, well, you know, you're giving me a really hard time, but you are a much better lover than you used to be, things like this, and would sort of reset the temperature of that discussion. So they do things like that. There's a paper that Susan Charles and I published in Psychology and Aging in December, where we were looking at how older people and younger people respond to overhearing derogatory remarks made about themselves. So they listen to audio tapes. Ostensibly, these are people saying things about them. And then they do this talk aloud response, or give us this kind of talk aloud response. And they don't get as angry as younger people do. They get sad. So again, the emotion system isn't broken here. Older people experience these emotions, but they weren't angry and they weren't as interested as younger people were in going back and fighting with the person who said the derogatory remark. They just sort of had this different emotional response to it. It looks like poignancy increases with age. That is the co-occurrence of positive and negative emotions. And this also appears in our longitudinal findings of emotional experience in day-to-day life, where increasingly with age, people are having more mixed emotions. We've done a fair amount of work, mostly with Mara Mather over the years, in recent years, examining cognitive consequences of these motivational shifts. That is, goals direct attention, direct memory, direct action, right? So if goals are changing, we would expect to see systematic changes in what people attend to and what they remember. So if you show older people images like these, and also these, they're much more likely to remember this than they are to remember that. Mara Mather, again, led a study in our group, also focused on attention, showing people different images where there were two images of the same person, one posing an emotion face, either positive or negative, negative in this case, and being paired with a neutral one. And older people look away toward the neutral one when it's paired with a negative face. And when it's paired with a positive face, they look toward the positive face. So it looks like, again, cognitive processing or resources are being allocated to well-being, that is, to regulation. And now, many studies conducted by our group, but also by other people in this room, Natalie Denberg and others, and Derek Isaacowitz, have also documented this kind of preference for positive over negative. And we've come to call this the positivity effect. So the positivity effect is a developmental shift whereby younger people who focus mostly on negative, where negative stimuli seem to be most attention-grabbing, that tendency shifts with age such that older people are paying more attention to positive. It's more attention-grabbing. Now, when I talk with younger audiences about these kinds of findings, they often say, how do I get to be old? This sounds pretty good to me. We don't think this is particularly good. We think it's adaptive to one's place in the life cycle and probably wouldn't be good for younger adults. But it's also clearly context-specific. It's aimed, we think, this shift toward realizing chronically activated goals. That's not good in all circumstances. Corinna Lockenhoff, who is here, now a assistant professor at Cornell, in her dissertation showed that if you present people with a decision that they need to make, so they're choosing among different healthcare plans, and you give them a grid like this, which is exactly what people saw when they came into the laboratory, and you say, behind those dark boxes is negative information about the plan, behind the white boxes, good information about the plan, that what happens is that older people disproportionately look at the positive information. So now to be clear, everybody looks at all the boxes, but then older people keep going back to those positive aspects. Now, one would think that wouldn't be particularly good for making high-quality decisions. Because we think this is goal-directed, motivated, not something due to neural degradation, Corinna applied an intervention where she gives different instructions. She changes the goal. She tells people in the study, I want you to be as accurate as you can. And she reminds them of that instruction over and over, and this positivity effect disappears. We have recently become concerned about differences in the anticipation of positive and negative emotion. It looks like older people respond to potential gains just as younger people do. Here's some neural evidence for that. So if you look at the younger brains, older brains, you see no differences in a task developed by Brian Knudsen, who you'll hear from and meet later today, when they're playing this game in a brain scanner. But when you look at the loss trials, that is when people might lose on the next trial, you see activation, similar activation in younger adults, but basically no brain activation in response to potential loss. So we've been thinking about the possibility of, or sort of susceptibility to fraud. That is, if somebody's pitching you a positive message and you remember that and you're not attending to what could go wrong, that people may be more vulnerable to that. Greg Ximenez-Larkin has also recently collected some data that suggests that older adults may learn just as well as younger adults in reinforcement trials, on positive learning trials, but that they don't learn well on loss trials or avoidance learning. So avoidance learning in his work looks like it declines with age, but gain learning doesn't. Again, very important implications for how one might frame information and intervene when you need a message fully understood and remembered by older adults. So we're beginning to think that there is a systematic kind of a change in motivation. It's a change that benefits emotion and emotional well-being, and it's a change that comes to direct cognitive resources to particular kinds of stimuli. We think now that we've got that kind of pattern identified, we can begin to apply it to a lot of applied questions quite systematically to see if we can use these kinds of findings to improve functioning in different areas. Thank you.
So now, the way we set this up, we have time for questions directed to Laura's talk, her framing talk for this thing. So if you have a question, you can either raise your hand or shout out rudely. Or both. Or both.
Yes.
These findings have mainly to do with main effects of age. What do you understand about the variability within those effects and the individual differences?
We've looked at individual differences in some studies, and where we do, it looks like, so in social selection in particular, in social networks, we've looked at those patterns of shifting social networks in people who are extroverts, neurotics, introverts, and so on. And it looks like you see the same main effect basically by age, but of course if you're an extrovert, your network's bigger than if you're not. So it looks like we're seeing the same kinds of things by individual differences. No, we haven't looked a lot at individual differences, and I surely would not rule them out. That there'll be some people who show this and some who don't. I mean, to add to that, some people who don't show that social selection is good for mental health. So it correlates. These declining, smaller networks are good for older people's mental health. If you look at people who don't do this pruning process, they're actually suffering more than people who are. So that would again suggest what you're saying is surely worthy of further investigation. Yes.
So do you think that the selectivity, the broadening piece of the life course is required for the selectivity piece? So another way to ask this is, could I just like trim the fat in my life right now and sort of deepen the meaningful things and really get that, or does part of the life course process really require us to broaden and expand and then select? if you were to reverse engineer these kinds of things, what are the applications to midlife kinds of processes?
Well, again, we kind of think this is adaptive. We don't think you have to get old to see this, and the reason we say that is we've studied people who have HIV, for example, and are closer to the end of their lives, even though they're younger. We did this study before there were cocktails and so on, and you see the same sorts of changes in younger adults. And in fact, that's one of the key premises of this theory is it's not age, that it's something about time horizon, so you could see them shift. But I think you're asking something a little differently. It's sort of like, could I volitionally say I'm going to deepen? And of course, one could. We're doing some research right now on where we're training, Lis Nielsen is involved in this too, training a Buddhist meditation on death in younger adults to see if we can instantiate this kind of positivity effect in cognitive processing. Again, a kind of paradoxical idea that if you make people think about the end of life, they actually shift to more positive, more positive directions. So we think they can. Sonia?
The effects you described have to do with how older people themselves are thinking and remembering. But how much do you think, how much of these effects might be due to how other people respond to older people? Like you described a study where they listen to negative feedback, but actually I don't think people are giving negative feedback as much to an older person as they might to their younger friends. So maybe some of that is like a social effect.
Yeah, very possibly. Corinna has some data that would suggest that that's true. So Corinna did a study, and yell if I'm saying this wrong, where she's looking at younger people's time horizons with particular social partners. So when you interact with your grandmother, who may not be around forever, do you also shift your goal for that relationship? That is, you don't want to rehash necessarily all the things you don't like about her that might improve over time, but that people become more meaningful, and that's supported by her data as well. Is that fair? So it very well be that social work gets better. I mean, you could also make the argument, if you're writ large, that there's all sorts of ageism and that older people actually have lots of negative interactions as well. But in that inner circle, my hunch is they're getting better. They report that they're better. They're more satisfied with their relationships than younger people are.
I've always been curious whether socio-emotional selectivity theory holds for older adults who have had lifelong primary psychiatric disorders.
We don't know. We've tried to run a study on depression at Stanford with Ian Gottlieb, and we just can't find enough depressed people to run them. So that's a problem. But our hunch is, our hypothesis is that they wouldn't show that effect. That it's about regulation, and so if people have dysfunctional abilities to regulate, you wouldn't expect to see it. That's what we would hypothesize, so we're with you on that. You also, Mara Mather did a study that I think is one of the best studies supporting this motivational explanation for the preference for positive, and that if you place high demand on cognitive load during a task, the positivity effect not only is eliminated, it goes to a negativity effect, which really suggests that people are putting some effortful, cognitive energy into this attention to positive. But in that study also, Mara, again, tell me if I'm wrong, but as I reached this study, show that people with the highest levels of executive functioning show the positivity effect the most. So if you extend that down the other end to dementia, for example, another disorder, you wouldn't expect to see it in demented patients. That's what I would hypothesize. Does that sound right, Mark?
So that will have to be the last. This is the hard part of what I'm doing. I'm sorry, but we'll sort of queue questions up and get to as many as we can. But to stay on. So thank you, Laura. Our next speaker is Louise Phillips, and I don't know, was it a year ago we were all in England with our sort of counterparts in the British Research Society, and Louise gave us a brilliant talk that I just totally enjoyed. The only thing I'm a little worried about is we were in this elegant room with columns and turn of the century antique furniture. So we tried to build a column for her, but we couldn't. You can take a look over there. And this is your first time in California?
It's my first time on the west coast of America, so this is really exciting. Well, I do recognize the fog. We have lots of fog in Aberdeen all the time, so this is very familiar to me.
Well, we did that for you. And Louise's talk is called Aging and the Use of Emotional Social Judgments.
All right, it's probably good that I'm wearing a clip-on microphone because my tendency is to wander as I talk, which isn't good for video, so I'm going to stand still and say this. So one of the things that I'm interested in is looking at age differences, both in relation to, I guess, normal aging, and also we've been looking a lot at abnormal aging, dementia and stroke and so on, and how these things affect social cue processing in older age, and in particular looking at how across the lifespan there might be changes in the abilities and motivations to actually process emotional information from other people. And we're beginning to get, sorry, I'm still wandering, we're beginning to get a clearer picture now of the kinds of effects of aging on emotion perception. And we're also beginning to understand some of the factors that may underlie those differences, so some of the neural, motivational, and cognitive and perceptual issues that might be involved in age changes in the way that emotions are interpreted. Another interest, though, is not just looking at how aging might affect our ability and the way in which we interpret emotional cues from other people, but also the consequences that that might have. So if as you get older you have a different interpretation of the emotions of people looking at you than younger people do, does that have social consequences, I guess? So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And this is work that's being done with Gillian Slessor and Rebecca Bull in Aberdeen. And Gillian Slessor is a PhD student who's actually gathered the data I'm going to talk about. She's a superstar, and I feel really mean talking about her fantastic data, but there we go. Okay. So today I'm going to talk just then about one tiny example of a result which suggests that it could be interesting to try and look at this interaction between making emotional judgments and social behavior in more detail. So let me just give you a little bit of background then. So the kind of tasks that I'm talking about are these emotion perception tasks where you see a face, and these are the very famous Ekman faces. People in the UK are obsessed with faces. Every psychologist in the UK researches faces, you know. I doubt there is a single person within 10 miles radius of a psychology department in the UK who is not familiar with this particular set of American faces. But these are the kind of faces that we use in these kind of studies. We ask people to say what kind of emotion is being shown in the face. And these have been used in quite a number of different aging studies now, and there's a relatively clear pattern of results, which we kind of summarized in a meta-analysis in which we showed that older people are less accurate than young people in identifying facial expressions of sadness, anger, and fear. So sadness, anger, and fear, these ones here. So older people are less accurate at doing that. The age differences in identifying happiness and surprise are much smaller, and there's this really intriguing result that older people are better than younger people at identifying, expressions of disgust. And I was thinking about talking about that today, but I decided not to. I'm going to talk about something else. So as people get older then, they get worse at identifying some expressions of emotion from other people, and those are important social cues in our environment. And so one of the things that we're interested in is what might the social consequences of these age differences in emotion perception be? And one way in which we're trying to look at that is by looking more broadly at whether there might be any relationships between emotion recognition and some aspects of social participation. And I guess for that, we're also looking at that in populations like dementia and stroke, and we're doing some longitudinal studies to investigate those kinds of issues. But what I'm going to talk about today is much more experimental and focused, and that's much more a lab-based approach. What we're trying to do there is to try and see whether any age effects in emotion perception might have implications for social judgments, such as judgments of social approach. Okay, so there's evidence that gaze cues can moderate, so by gaze cues I mean where eyes are looking, can moderate the perception of emotion. So for example, if you ask people which of these two faces is more angry, they'll generally say the angry face with direct gaze as compared to the angry face with averted gaze. And this is evidence from, for example, Adams and Kleck, that in younger people, angry faces with direct gaze are rated as being more angry. And there's two sort of very clear reasons why this might be. It might be because if someone's angry and they're looking at you, they might be angry with you. So that's going to make them seem more angry. And there's also a kind of socially threatening aspect to it. If someone's angry and they're looking at you, they might be about to come and punch you. So you need to probably be thinking about that. So angry faces then with direct gaze are generally seen as more threatening and more angry. Well, we know that older people have difficulty in recognizing angry expressions, and we also know that as people get older, they seem to process information about eyes differently and perhaps pay less attention to eyes. And for example, as people get older, they have more difficulty in discriminating subtle differences in eye gaze, and they're less susceptible to joint attention that is following the eye gaze of other people. So because of this, we thought it would be kind of interesting to look at whether there are any age differences in integrating gaze and emotion cues. And if so, we basically predicted that older people would make less distinction between direct and averted gaze when they were responding to angry faces. So in these tasks then, we did firstly a kind of emotion task, which relates back to the kind of tasks that have been done by Adams and Kleck and others, where we ask people which face is more angry. So they see an angry face with direct gaze, an angry face with averted gaze, and we ask people which of these looks more angry. And we thought that would be interesting to see whether there are any age differences there. But also, we figured that you might get age differences there because of the nature of that very explicit question you're asking people, which of these is more angry? And sometimes age differences in very explicit tasks can occur. So we thought it would also be useful to look at something that seemed to us, anyway, to be more of a kind of social judgment task. So we basically asked people to say, which of these people would you ask a favor? So the way we set up the task was we said, this is someone at 10 o'clock on Monday morning. This is them at 10 o'clock on Tuesday morning. When would you ask them for a favor? And that seems like a fairly abstract and crazy task, but anyone working in my lab would tell you that I quite often look angry on Monday mornings and angry on Tuesday mornings, and they have to decide when they're going to come and ask me to read their work. So I guess it's not entirely beyond the realms of possibility. But the whole point of this task is we're not directly asking about emotion here, we're asking about social approach behavior. So I have one slide of results as requested, and I'll just talk you through these. So just one slide. It's quite a complicated graph, though, unfortunately. Okay, so here we go then. So the first task that we were asking people to do is just simply looking at direct gaze and looking at averted gaze, angry faces, which of these is more angry? And of course, what we're expecting is following the literature that's been published already, we expect that people will choose direct gaze as being more angry. And that's what we find for younger people. So here is young people on the left here, and they are basically, this is measuring how often they choose the direct gaze is more angry as compared to the averted gaze. And young people are significantly more likely than chance to choose the direct gaze as being more angry, and they're much more likely than old people to choose the direct gaze as being more angry. And in fact, old people perform exactly at chance. They're equally likely to choose direct or averted gaze as being more angry. So it doesn't make any difference to them which way the gaze is looking. They're going to just choose fairly much at random. And then the second question that we were asking was, what percentage of time did people choose the averted gaze this time when you ask people for a favor? So this is the social task. We're asking people, when would you ask someone for a favor? But this time what we predict is that they're going to choose the person with averted gaze because that's the person who is not so threatening. So in this task, how often would you, which of these faces would you choose if you're asking someone for a favor? We predict people are going to choose the averted gaze more often than direct. And that's exactly what we find for young people. So young people are significantly more likely than chance to choose the averted gaze when they're asking someone for a favor. There's also a very large age differences, but in fact there's almost a kind of qualitative difference here because old people are actually choosing the person with direct gaze to ask a favor, and that's significantly different to chance as well. So we get a big age difference, but almost a kind of qualitative difference between the choices that are being made in younger and older adults of who they would ask the favor, the person with direct or averted gaze. Okay, and this evidence then suggests that younger and older people differ in their effects of emotion on the kind of social judgments that they're making. And I've just presented the data on anger, but we've also looked at disgust, at sadness, at fear, at happiness, at different types of smiles and various other things, trying to look at some similar social judgment tasks. From the results on anger, it seems fairly clear that older adults' judgments about emotion, so which of these faces is angrier, is unaffected by gaze direction, unlike young people. And I guess one obvious interpretation of this could be that perhaps there is a cognitive load that's involved in trying to integrate information about emotion and eye gaze together, and the older people are not doing this so much. But I think there's a number of other potential explanations. There may be some motivational differences that could be key. For example, not processing the information about emotion to the same degree of depth in older people. And there's also some potential neural changes which might be interesting as well, such as less amygdala activation while viewing emotions such as anger that might actually be influencing some of these decisions. Another interesting finding then was that when we looked at the social judgment task, who would you ask for a favor, we found that older adults' decisions were influenced by eye contact, who was looking at them, rather than the emotion-eye gaze interaction. That person's angry, they're not looking at me, so I might choose them. So it seemed as though there was different reasons that older and younger may have chosen the choices that they did in that task, and I think we need to understand a lot more about that. And I think we're very interested in trying to explore eye contact and how that may change with aging. Not quite sure how we're going to do that yet, but it seems like a really important issue to address. And I think what we're trying to argue is that some of these age-related changes in emotional and social cue decoding could have some quite interesting influences on social behavior that might turn out to be important. Deciding when you're going to approach someone, deciding when you're going to interact with them is a very important decision that you have to make sometimes. And so we thought it would be interesting to explore that in more detail. So just to sum up that then, basically, we found that there are age differences in integrating emotional and eye gaze information from faces, and we think this might have implications for social behavior. And for me, one of the really key challenges that I really need to try and get my head around now, I'm an experimental cognitive psychologist by background. I like things to be in the lab and really neat and tidy. But I'm feeling like I really need to kind of reach out and look in more detail at real-life social behaviors in order to really address how some of these emotional perception aspects might have some important consequences. So that's what I'm scared of, and that's what I think my next challenge is to be thinking about. Thank you.
That's a great example of an interesting finding that you just kind of grabs you.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
yeah.
Let's see what sort of, Steve, do you have the answer?
Yeah, that'd be good.
I was wondering if the lack of discrimination may reflect, a more basic lack of recruitment of attentional resources, which would be consistent with the reduced amygdala activation to anger faces, which I think is reinstated to is associated with age-related declines in androgen levels. It's reestablished the level of younger women with androgen supplementation. So it seemed that there might be a core sort of attentional feature which just wipes out the rest of the higher discriminations.
Yeah, I think that is definitely a possible explanation. It's certainly one of the things that we're considering, and obviously we'd like to explore that in some more detail. What I'm still not sure about is whether that can explain the kind of opposite choice, so choosing the averted gaze rather than direct. I think it might be able to, because maybe you're just looking at the fact, this person's looking at me, so I'm going to choose them because they're looking at me. So it's possible that that might still explain that result as well. But I do think that is potentially one of the things we need to look into.
I just thought, I was thinking that maybe one of the things about late life is a lot of times you're invisible, and when people are attending to you, you might find that much more salient. I don't know what some of the people who studied this. Brian, did you come here? Sorry, nice to see you. Other questions? Louise? Yeah.
Is it possible that happiness is just easier to recognize than these other emotions, so that you don't see the age difference? I'm happy. I mean, I'm not sure. Disgust also is a pretty easy expression to recognize, but surprise probably not.
Yeah,
so much so.
I mean, I actually, in fact, read the meta-analysis yesterday, and I'm slightly embarrassed to say that my slide's wrong, because basically what we found in the meta-analysis was that there were very small age differences in identifying happiness and surprise, such that older people were actually worse at identifying them. But those differences were so small that they aren't significant in any of the individual studies. It is a problem that happiness is too easy to recognize, certainly in many of the studies. But one way you can deal with that is to make the emotion less intense. So if you make the task more difficult by making the emotion more intense, for both happiness and disgust, thinking about disgust in particular, when we make disgust less intense, so it's a much more difficult task. Still, you get older people doing slightly better than younger people, so I don't think it is just that in disgust. It's really intriguing what's going on there, though.
There's those of you who fact score, well, we know that as you go from category 1 to category 2, category 2 to 1, I guess, you have a lot more muscles involved inside sadness, anger, fear, than happiness, surprise, and disgust. I don't know if that would be a clue, but those are the 3 most muscular of the expressions.
Sure, there might be just more perceptual clues almost, and I think all that kind of issue needs to be looked at as well. I've always been slightly wary about over-interpreting this because it's still not entirely clear to me how much some of this is related very specifically to the Ekman faces, which is what we use in all our studies, versus more general aspects of emotions.
One last question, anyone?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is the difficulty in differentiating between the negative emotions, or actually even identifying a negative emotion?
No, most of these studies, I think it's about differentiating between the negative emotions that probably is the key issue that's going on there. I think, I'm not sure that anyone has simply looked at identifying negative versus positive emotions, just doing it in a very broad terms, but most of these people make mistakes. The mistakes that older people make are quite similar to the mistakes that younger people make. They're not making qualitatively different mistakes, and it is generally mixing up different negative emotions.
Great, thanks a lot. Wow, did you guys sort of record? Yeah, this is great. So Derek Isaacowitz is going to be talking about what is the function of age-related positive gaze preferences. We're sort of tying this together. And Fredda, you have to now change your topic.
Well, no, actually, I have something to tie right in.
No.
Yep, fantastic.
Perfect.
Well, I'm very happy to be here, and I really appreciate, thanks Bob and Liz for including me. And what I want to talk about today is work that was really inspired by what Laura has just spoken to you about. And based on Laura's work, when I started at Brandeis, I was interested to see how, to what degree older and younger adults differed in their visual processing of emotional images, and to what extent we could show that older adults are pursuing emotional goals and goals of emotion regulation in their visual processing of emotional images. And in several studies, we did find evidence consistent with this idea of positivity effects, such that older adults seem to preferentially attend to positive over negative stimuli. And what I want to talk to you about today, and I have 2 data slides, so it's still a small number. And what I want to talk to you about today are recent efforts to try to demonstrate what the function is of these visual preferences that older adults show, as we are able to demonstrate, to show that older adults seem to be looking more at positive than negative stimuli. What I'll tell you about today is our attempts, and you'll see that it's been a little bit complicated, to see whether older adults are indeed using these positive visual preferences to try to regulate how they feel. And so these are attempts to really to illustrate that positive gaze preferences in older adults show a mood regulatory function. And just to quickly show you how we look at attentional preferences, in my lab we use eye tracking. It's now very commonly used among people in various areas of psychology. Quite simple. The subject is the person here on your left, and the eye tracker in this case is an ASL Series 6 eye tracker. It's actually a little video camera that's hiding under the computer monitor. And we, in our studies, each study may have a slightly different set of methods, but generally we're showing our subjects different sorts of emotional stimuli, pairs of emotional faces, real or synthetic, and generally asking them to look naturally as if they're at home watching television, to try to get a sense of their naturalistic gaze preferences. And so in the first data slide, I want to show you some findings that were the first place that we saw a clear link between older adults' positive preferences in where they're looking from eye tracking and something about their mood. So we had a paradigm in which we ensured that our subjects, both younger and older adults, were in a variety of mood states before they started looking at emotional images. And we were curious whether, first of all, we wanted to replicate our previous finding that older adults tend to look more at positive stimuli using the eye tracking method, but we also wanted to see if there was some link between older adult looking patterns and their mood. And our thinking was that to the extent that positive gaze preferences are reflecting these older adults' older adults' goals to regulate their emotions, as Laura spoke so eloquently about, then we would expect to see that those older subjects who are in a state where they have a mood that they need to regulate would be especially likely to demonstrate positive gaze preferences. And that is, in fact, what we found. When we looked at our subjects who came to the eye tracking task either in a positive mood already or in a neutral mood, we didn't find much action. We found that young adults tended to show sort of mood congruent gaze patterns. If they were happy, they looked more at happy things. And the older adults didn't really show much preferential looking at all. And we found, though, that older adults did seem to activate their positive gaze preferences in this particular case when they were in a bad mood, presumably that they were motivated to regulate out of. And the way to read this data slide number 1 is that the stimuli here were pairs of emotional faces. One was emotional, I should say, and one was the same individual and non-emotional. Scores that are significantly greater than 0 indicate that subjects for that kind of stimulus pair showed a fixation preference towards the emotional picture, and scores that are significantly less than 0 indicate that subjects were looking away from the emotional image in the face pair and towards the neutral one. And I always show the slide, and I just don't know the names of these colors specifically. I want to say one is lavender, one's burgundy. I don't know. I don't know. I should just look that up in a paint thing. But what you can see pretty clearly here, even without me knowing the specific names of the colors, is that our younger adults who are in a bad mood before they start the eye tracking task, they're looking primarily at the negative face types. They're looking more at the angry faces and the fear faces. The older adults, same bad mood before they start the eye tracking, but they're showing a very different looking pattern. They're looking at happy faces and away from all 3 of the negative face types. And again, this was not true for the older adults in positive or neutral moods or for the young adults in any of the mood states. So this was one, I think, encouraging piece of evidence suggesting that indeed older adults' use of positive looking preferences is related to mood regulation, because the older people most likely to want to regulate their mood because they're already in a bad mood are exactly the ones who are showing this positive preference. And I think here you really see nicely the dissociation where the young adults in a bad mood show sort of standard mood congruent looking, and the older adults are showing a very different mood incongruent positive pattern. This highlighted this key functional question, though, which is, okay, that's supportive of the idea that positive gaze preferences show a mood regulatory function, but okay, do they work? I said that the older adults who showed the positive preference were in a bad mood starting the eye tracking. What mood were they in at the end of it? So what I want to talk about now is whether older adults' positive looking preferences lead them to successfully regulate their mood. And the answer is sometimes. It seems to depend on a number of other factors, and this is going to lead me into my data slide number 2 here. I'll tell you about one set of these factors. What we find is that looking at positive things sometimes helps older people to feel better. But it seems to depend on factors both about the person as well as about the situation. In particular, age makes a difference, not surprisingly. We also find that trait attentional functioning, the efficacy or the how well the person's attentional abilities are operating, makes a difference as well, and I'll show you that in a moment. It also seems to matter the nature of the situation, whether it's a sort of long task which requires lengthy regulation over a long time period, or whether the regulatory situation is one where regulation can happen quickly. So let me show you some data, because I know that that's sort of vague what I'm saying. We took our subjects and we put them into a task which for almost all of them was boring, and what I'm showing you here, the dependent variable is mood change over a 25-minute long boring task, and you can see that basically all of the scores are less than 0, indicating that for most subjects they experience this as a mood impairing kind of task. Their mood was going down from the beginning of the task to the end of the task. And what we find here, what I'm illustrating in this figure, is that whether people were able to, actually the task made people feel worse as it went on, which it did for most people, or whether there were some people who were able to stave off the negative mood that most of the subjects were susceptible to the extent that the ability to stay okay during this boring task was could be related to gaze preferences. It varied by age, but also it varied by the function of the attentional system. What we do in this study is we have all of our subjects complete Mike Posner's attention network task. It gives a variety of scores about the integrity of the attentional system. And what I'm showing you here are scores for the conflict scale, which is an indicator of executive functioning. And low conflict scores mean better executive control or executive functioning. And so my hands tend to be too shaky for this, but let me try to show you this. Here are people, we're going to look at the two cells of people who are at 0 or slightly above 0, meaning that they were able to not experience a mood decline during this boring task. Among our older subjects, the ones who could stay okay during this boring task, they looked at happy. They looked more at happy stimuli. They showed a positive gaze preference, and they were also the ones who were low in conflict scores, meaning their executive functioning was good. So old, looking at happy, good executive functioning, they felt the best. They were able to stave off the possibly negative mood effects of this task. The picture was very different, though, for this one group of young adults who was able to feel okay at the end of this boring task. They were actually people who looked the least at the happy faces, so they showed the least positive preference in their gaze, but again, they were the subjects who had the best executive functioning. And so this is very interesting in a number of ways. I mean, these older people here in these cells, they also were looking a lot at happy faces. They were showing a positive preference in their gaze, and yet it was not helping them in this context to regulate how they felt. They still experienced the mood decline. And it's also, I think, of interest that we have this combination that the role of executive functioning we see in both the young and the old, but in a different direction. That the older adults who have good executive functioning abilities, they feel good by looking at the positive. Young adults with good executive control abilities, they feel good actually by looking less at the positive. And that sort of gets one thinking, I think, and I'd love to talk more about this, about why young adults can regulate how they feel in this context by engaging less with positive and presumably more with negative information, whether they're using that as cues for reappraisal or some other regulatory strategy. But it's pretty clear that young adults are not benefiting, they don't benefit from a positive looking strategy like the older adults do in some cases. So that's my confusing new finding that I wanted to talk about. What can we conclude from it, and what are the implications? Well, clearly there are age differences in processes that are relevant to mood and emotion regulation. So we see age differences in gaze patterns, but there are also individual differences in whether those regulatory processes, those gaze patterns, lead to good regulatory outcomes. So it's not enough that the age groups differ in the process that they use. There are age differences and also individual differences in the outcomes associated with these processes. I think what this means is that we really need to think about different paths to emotion and mood regulation for different individuals in different contexts. The example I showed you was one particular context, a boring task that took about 25 minutes. But if you get a different context, and we see this if we look at different sorts of tasks, the rules change a little bit if it's just a quick task, not one where some people are actually getting happier, the predictors are different. So I think it's important that we need to think about different paths to adaptive regulation and the possibility, as we saw in the graph I just showed you, that not every path actually leads to successful regulation. There are some paths for some people in some contexts that actually are not associated with adaptive regulation. And in closing, I'd like to say that looking at the function of these looking preferences in real time, it's quite complex, and it makes me want to tear my hair out a lot. But I think it's quite important as we try to figure out specifically what things like positive gaze preferences are doing for older people and when. Thank you very much.
Time for one question, Jenny.
I'm not sure if you already said this, but in your study where you have the negative mood, if you were to substitute a mental load instead of negative mood manipulation, do you think you would find the same thing or something different?
That's an interesting question. We have not done that with, we've done studies where we've manipulated cognitive load in our older subjects and found that in Mara's work, she's found that if you have a big cognitive load manipulation, older adults can't show positivity effects. We find that they can show positivity effects with small distractors. They can still do it. But if we did that in young adults, I'm not sure. Do you think that we would see the same pattern?
I'm just wondering if what you're seeing is sort of people reverting to some kind of default strategy rather than it's actually a negative mood making them striving for emotion regulation. I was just curious if there were any data on that.
Yeah, no, I don't have any relevant to that, but it's a good question. Thanks. Yeah, no, thanks. No more time.
Eric. Our next speaker, probably one of the best whistlers on the planet.
He said you were a great whistler, one of the best on the planet.
Fredda Blanchard-Fields has been one of the leaders in this area of research right from the beginning, and today she's going to talk about affective emotion regulation in older adulthood, converging levels of analysis.
As we heard in the previous talks, which lead very nicely into what I want to talk about in terms of the role of emotion regulation, Laura so nicely talked about it in terms of motivating processing goals, and Derek talked about attentional processes, and Laura also brought up the whole paradox of well-being and daily hassles, that older adults tend to remain happy throughout life, through a major portion of their life, and in doing so, researchers are interested in what are candidates to explain this paradox. And one of them lies in emotion, in the sense of the tendency to avoid negative arousal and the ability to manage negative arousal. Not just focusing on the positive, but we have to deal with the negative as well. So it's not just the prioritization of emotion-related goals, but are older adults more effective at the emotion regulation? We've been talking around emotion regulation. Derek got more at it in terms of gaze leading to emotion regulation. But what is effective emotion regulation, and are older adults really better at that? And that's a question that's not really addressed directly in the literature, and that's what I want to talk about. So in my past research, I've looked at self-report in the sense that older adults report that they use strategies, a variety of strategies. They're sensitive to the context. They read the problem situation. They use them. They're more concerned about regulating emotions as well as solving the problem, and they use strategies very strategically in terms of combinations of strategies to deal with their emotions. They've been rated as more effective. They report that they're more effective. But what I want to argue here in the spirit of this workshop is that we need converging levels of analysis to deal with this in terms of what is effectiveness, what is effective emotion regulation, not just in self-report. And so right now I have an ongoing study looking at event momentary assessment, where we're looking at it in terms of moving from self-report now at least closer to the action. In the past 2 hours, what did you experience? What problems did you experience? Emotions, and how did you regulate them? And then have biomarkers of physiological wear and tear in terms of dealing with those emotions, so integrating stress with emotions. I'm not going to go into that now because that data is only 2/3 completed. But it's really important. And to get at that level in terms of more objective measures of effective regulation in terms of physiological and health outcomes. But also, which I will get into just a little bit, the links between behavior and brain activation in terms of what is being activated as older adults are regulating emotion, and is that different? And there's some interesting findings that are just in their infancy right now. What I want to focus on is some recent studies that I've done on online emotion regulation. So Susan Charles and Laura and others talk about one of the things that older adults do best is avoid negative emotions and high arousal. So they're really good at selecting, as Laura was talking about. They select it out. But you can't always do that. You are exposed to negative emotion, and how do you regulate in those cases? And Bob Levenson, Uta Kunzman, and others have looked at that. Now, in terms of emotion, and I call it emotion regulation efficiency, are there the degree to which there are cognitive costs or effort, it's very effortful and difficult for older adults to regulate emotions, would be, or easy to regulate emotions, would be the efficiency in regulating emotions. So a little different twist on effectiveness. Now, if you look at the literature, it says decline in cognitive control, executive functioning should lead to more effortful emotion regulation in older adults in comparison to young adults. You look at neuroscience evidence for increased activation of older adults in areas related to cognitive control, and executive functioning is implicated in emotion regulation. So you would think, well, that means that older adults probably aren't so good at emotion regulation. It takes too much cognitive effort, and the whole history of cognitive aging research shows that when you have dual task paradigms, et cetera, older adults do more poorly when you tax them. However, if we look at what's just been talked about, what Laura's talked about, my previous research, given that growing older is related to increased focus on and better regulation of emotions, at least they report it, and in terms of strategy selection, it could be less costly for older adults than it is for young adults. So what we've done in just a recent study that we published is that we actually used a dual task paradigm. So here we induce disgust. They can identify it, so they can also react to it. And thanks to Bob, we got a nice disgusting film, which is an oxymoron. It works really well in terms of, I won't go into what the film is about. So we induce disgust. And then we instruct individuals that you either have to downregulate that disgust, get rid of it, make it as positive as you can, or maintain it, no instructions at all, or individuals who did not see the disgusting film. So as they're either regulating or not regulating the emotion, they also have to perform a very taxing working memory task, which has been known to tax executive functioning, et cetera, very difficult for older adults. We have a dual task paradigm. So what we're interested in here is the degree to which regulating emotions disrupts learning on this working memory task. And this was the interesting finding that we're trying to replicate now in the lab, is the instructions to downregulate is what I want to focus on. Emotions disrupt working memory performance in young adults, but not in older adults. So here you have, oh my gosh, you can't see this. There's a line there, and there's a line going up there over here. So it's the opposite effect. So for young adults, when they had to regulate emotions, it disrupted their the practice effects, the learning curve for this working memory task. It actually, and it's up here for older adults, it actually enhanced their performance. And so what we were interested in contrary to all the evidence that suggests that executive functioning is implicated in emotion regulation, which should make it more difficult for older adults, there's something going on in terms of they are more efficient. It's a well-practiced skill. In the lab now, what we're looking at is another form of regulation, suppression of expression, which is a different form that's typically used in these dual task paradigms, although people tend not to specifically look at suppression of expression or downregulating experience of negative emotion. And when we find that, when we ask older adults to suppress the expression of emotion, then, and this is a Stroop task, which I don't have time to go into, but you can see that with suppress, there is more of a cognitive cost for their performance. So trying to suppress emotion and then having to perform a difficult cognitive task, older adults are at a disadvantage. So we're really interested in terms of trying to define these the possibility, the automaticity of emotion regulation in older adults, and the issue of suppression of expression of emotion may require greater resources. And so it's a much more complex picture than older adults are better at regulating emotions than young adults. It's when you start getting at these fine-grained analyses. So what I wanted to do is I got into discussion mode and started all these wonderful discussion points that I can bring up later. But what I wanted to do is just one more slide that relates to Louise's finding. And Laura talked about anger. The special case of anger was emerging in my research too, which is really interesting in the sense that older adults avoid anger and are worse at identifying anger. Jenny Stanley did an emotion recognition, and we could get rid of all the age differences in recognizing every emotion except anger. Is that me? Oh, no. So here we did a study looking at event-related potential, and just the bottom line here, in doing a task where you had to look at angry, sad, or happy faces, here for young adults we see an emotion enhancement effect. We see amplification when they are looking at an emotional stimulus as compared to a neutral stimulus, the typical emotional enhancement effect. But here, what we have for older adults is that there's no effect for happy and sad, but this is the effect that, and this is a study in progress right now, that we're really toying with, is that anger again came out, and we've replicated this at different levels of this ERP study, is that there's a de-amplification very early on in the process in terms of deactivation, de-amplification happening in the visual cortex for anger. very quickly, when they just have to identify a probe for an angry face, they are de-amplifying. So they are moving away from anger very early on in the process. And so we're finding that this is very typical in a number of different levels of analysis, not just at this attentional level, at the more macro level of solving everyday problems and regulating emotions, and at other more momentary levels of analysis, that they not only select out, but when they're exposed to the negativity, their attention is de-amplified from that negative emotion. What am I doing on time?
It's a good time to stop if we're work.
Okay, so I will just stop here.
And then P300 difference was not significant, right? It was just the...
Which one?
That last slide.
This is significant here.
But if you go to the P3...
Yes.
That's not.
Right.
All right, great. Thank you. Time for some questions. Louise?
I was just going to ask about your suppression of expression and street finding. When we did suppression with older adults, we found that they were actually better at suppressing.
Exactly.
And so I wondered whether you had a trade-off, maybe, that older adults were actually suppressing more. And did you actually measure the extent to which they were suppressing expression as well?
Well, this is, again, a study in progress, so this is just a portion. But what we do is have a webcam, and so we're going to be coding their faces in terms, because disgust is a really easy emotion to identify, so that's why we're using it too, because when you see them suppressing it, you can really identify it. But that's an excellent question, the degree to which they're engaging in the suppression of emotion. And, you know, older adults don't tend to suppress their emotions. I mean, it's just like they're at a stage of life like, you know, been there, done that. You're just going to see how I feel, and that's all there is to it. So it's nothing that they have to do on a regular basis. So this may take more cognitive effort. And so the interesting thing is that you're reading through this literature, the cognitive depletion literature, Roy Baumeister's work, and others, is they're not really distinguishing between downregulating experience and suppression of emotion. And there seems to be a big difference in terms of how costly it is. There's two people. I don't know who's one.
Just to follow up on that, was there age differences in the downregulation success? In the
I didn't show that. No, everybody was downregulated. So and everybody reacted. There's a lot of people you have to dump from the study because they don't react to the negative emotion. But yes, there was the downregulation, and it showed the proper differences given the instruction group you were in. Yes.
I'm wondering if we can kind of zero in on what strategy they might have been using to downregulate. Do you mind sharing your instructions with us? What it was exactly?
Oh, well, no. Well, actually, that's a really good question, because that's what we're actually going into. The instruction for the downregulating, now I have to use my memory, this is a bad thing. It was to downregulate your emotions so that you feel positive and that type of thing. So that you, something to that extent, but
so that you feel positive rather than so you feel less negative?
I'm pretty sure that's what we said, or so that, I can't remember exactly what we're going to use right now. However, you still have a key point here, because it's still an open question what they were doing to downregulate the experience of emotion. We've now separated it out in just terms of suppression of expression, but I have another study with a student who we're looking at different strategies that we're asking, and interestingly, young adults start looking like older adults when you ask them to avoid, not reappraise, but to avoid negative stimuli in watching a film that's negative, just to avoid the negative stimuli. Then they start looking like older adults. So we're doing exactly what you're saying. We have to really pinpoint what that strategy is.
Okay, great. Well, I know this is going to be, I think you're going to make an exception. I was going to ask you if you would comment on it later, but James, would you weigh in on this?
I was intrigued by your findings, and you just said something that I'd love you to expand on. You said that you had
briefly
toss. Briefly expand on the point that you had to toss a number of participants who weren't reactive. I was interested whether there were differences as a function of age.
That's a really good question. There weren't. But well, actually, what happened mostly is there were more young adults, but we used the fear factor thing with the eating the disgusting stuff. And young adults, and this may be a regulation strategy, started laughing at it and saying this is funny. And so those are the main ones that we had to toss from this. But that's a really important point. We are actually looking at the people that we had to throw out too. We're not throwing them out. Good point.
Thank you for also check the wire with the battery. Just make sure it's in all well.
The wire, which one? The one that's in here? Because I've been using it. I've been adjusting that after each speaker. It seemed to help when I do.
Our next speaker is, I think, my oldest friend in psychology, Steve Manuck. I've told some of you that I think we ate lunch together every day for 4 years. And then we realized we really had nothing to say. It was the first time I've talked to him in about 30 years. But
That's not entirely true.
We made for a pretty good story. But Steve's talk is called Correlates of Social Position in Brain Serotonergic Function.
You ever go to a conference and you sit down with the speakers in Salon C for the symposium, you get tied up with the talks, and it's your turn to go on, and you realize that your symposium was in Salon D. Well, come with me to Salon D. Okay, what I'm going to talk about is the potential coupling of two things that don't ordinarily conjoin, which are social position and brain function. And I come to this topic rather indirectly through a disease of aging, atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, which is basically the transition from patent to pasty arteries, which occurs in virtually all of us, and then the transition from clogged to occluded arteries, which occurs in some of us. And epidemiology has identified a host of risk factors for atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. Some of these are biological attributes of risk, such as elevated blood pressure, lipid abnormalities, obesity, insulin resistance, more recently systemic inflammation, dysregulation of cardiac autonomic control, stress-related reactivity. Other risk factors are attributes of habit and lifestyle, such as smoking, sedentary lifestyle, dietary imprudence, excessive alcohol consumption, and still others are psychosocial, such as disorders and traits of mood and affect, depression, anxiety, feelings of hopelessness, anger and hostility, and social isolation. This has kept us all well-funded for many years. Now, it's of some interest epidemiologically that many of these risk factors tend to co-vary in populations and to aggregate in individuals. So to have one risk factor is generally to have more than one risk factor and often to have many simultaneously. Even those that might superficially appear to have, to accord with distinct etiologies. For example, a well-established correlation between traits of anger and hostility where these traits are correlated fairly appreciably extensively with interleukin-6, an inflammatory cytokine. So why that association? This has prompted some and us to look for, to consider whether there are yet unrecognized common mechanisms that might join many risk factors in populations and individuals. And as a start, we chose the central neuromodulator serotonin. And why serotonin? Well, first, its ubiquity in brain. Serotonergic neurons originate in the Ref-A nuclei and then project to virtually all other areas of the brain, both before and after of the Ref-A. More importantly, though, serotonin is known to modulate activity in neural circuitries of emotional processing, appetitive motivation, as well as those governing circulatory function, metabolism, and neuroendocrine and autonomic function. So in our work, we've tended to try to study serotonergic function in a couple of different ways, often through exploiting known genetic variation in the system, but more commonly through a standard neuropharmacologic challenge in which net central nervous system serotonergic responsivity, I'm just going to call that CSR, is indexed as the relative rise in circulating concentration of the pituitary hormone prolactin following acute stimulation or administration of a serotonin agonist, for example, fenfluramine hydrochloride, which is a potent serotonin-releasing agent and reuptake inhibitor. To make a long story short, 10 years short, we find that virtually all of these so-called aforementioned risk factors, psychosocial lifestyle, and biological are associated with low or reduced serotonergic function as reflected in the CSR index. That is depression, low daily positive affect, aggression, hostility, physical inactivity, and smoking, and amongst the biological, all the components of metabolic syndrome, as well as preclinical atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. So look here. Socioeconomic indicators, such as low education income, and at the community level, what the British like to refer to as material deprivation and social fragmentation, are associated with all of the same risk factors for heart disease that are also associated with attenuated CSR. So what does that mean? Is there an association between serotonergic function and social position as well? There's some precedent for thinking so, at least experimental work in non-human primates. This is from a study that Babette Fontenot, Jay Kaplan, John Mann, and I published a few years ago, in which we found that chronically perturbing the status relationships of male cynomolgus monkeys, which we achieved by repeatedly reorganizing social group memberships, lowered 5-HT function in the prefrontal cortex of these animals compared to unperturbed males that were housed in stable social groups. And this was seen as a reduced content in prefrontal cortex of both serotonin and serotonin's principal metabolite, 5-hydroxyandilacetic acid. And two, D. Higley, Steve Sumi, and their colleagues have shown that peer rearing, which is a model of maternal deprivation, causes lifelong suppression of 5-HT turnover in rhesus monkeys, seen here in both the juvenile and adult periods relative to mother-reared controls. And in humans, this is about the best we can do now. But yes, individuals of lower socioeconomic status, lower in income and educational attainment, are among our community sample, about 300 individuals, are also those who exhibit the least CSR, the lowest central serotonergic responsivity. The story isn't entirely over. Consider the study of the rhesus monkeys. In fact, the effect of peer rearing on life course persistent effect of peer rearing on central serotonergic function was seen only in animals that carried a particular allele, the short or deletion allele of a regulatory polymorphism in the serotonin transporter gene. This allele confers a reduced transcriptional efficiency on that gene. And there is an ortholog of the same polymorphism in humans located on chromosome 17. And we find also that the covariation of socioeconomic indicators with central serotonergic function varies by genotype, such that about a quarter of the variants, these are nominally high and low SES, but a quarter of the variants in, or the covariance of serotonergic function and SES is accounted for by individuals who are homozygous for the deletion allele and not at all among those homozygous for the alternate long allele, and the sort of intermediate effect amongst those who carry one long and one short allele. Now, finally, another way of indexing sort of social disparities is the use of sort of census data, which characterize attributes of neighborhoods of residence. And these are a variety of these sort of common indices that are reported in social epidemiologic literature. We asked also whether socioeconomic disadvantage might be associated with reduced serotonergic responsivity in our community sample, and these were sort of areas of lower income, poor housing, more people living alone, more children being raised without fathers. And again, we see that a relative socioeconomic disadvantage areas are associated with in individuals with a reduced serotonergic function. And the interesting thing is that this association is independent of personal socioeconomic indicators, person's own income and education, independent of race and of sex, also independent of a variety of enduring personal characteristics that are related to neighborhoods of residence, such as personality, IQ, and diet. I began to think about aging when I saw the title of the symposium. And in fact, I realized that community SES, or family community SES, in fact, does vary by age in its association with serotonergic function, so that we see the covariation of community level or area level socioeconomic indicators with CSR is present in older but not younger men, and in younger but not older women. The interesting thing about this is the only one I've pursued since I only had a few minutes on the plane, is that community SES in younger women is associated with a variety of cardiovascular risk factors, increased insulin, fasting insulin, higher blood pressure, lower HDL cholesterol concentration, and adjusting for central serotonergic function, adjusting for central serotonergic function, those associations dissipate. So it seems reasonable, and you can't make clear mediation conclusions from cross-sectional data, but nonetheless it seems consistent with the notion that the influence of community socioeconomic indicators, which we cannot write off or explain away with respect to any other person-level variables that we have, may influence risk through its effect on one brain monoaminergic system.
What's the age? Just the relationship between age and frontal serotonin.
There's a decline.
Yeah.
There's a decline, a small decline. Yeah, well, you see in both of those slides, there's an age main effect, and it probably accounts for about, across the age of our sample, which is usually like 30 to 60 or something, it maybe accounts for 14 or 15% of the variance, which is appreciable when you consider how much error is in our measurement to begin with.
The prerogative of asking the first question, sorry. Other questions?
Through some of the data slides really quickly, and I was trying to figure out, was there one type of set of alleles where the pure raising was not harmful for either of them? Is that right?
In the primate studies?
Yeah, in the primate studies, it looked like pure raising wasn't harmful for one.
Pure raising is not, was not harmful or significant, despite what the figure shows on the right hand, was not associated with variation in brain serotonin turnover against the background of homozygosity for the insertion allele of the transporter. Now what you don't see here are homozygous for the short allele, because the long alleles move so close to fixation in rhesus macaques that homozygotes are vanishingly rare.
Because I was wondering how well this fit with some of the ideas that some of these alleles, hypersensitize to the environment so that you do better in some environments when they're good, but worse in other environments when they're bad. And I was trying to figure out if this was consistent with that or not.
I think it is relatively consistent with it, though I think that, what these data show, in which almost all of the evidence of our gene-environment interaction that we have in other studies shows that it is against certain genotypes that are associated with a heightened sensitivity to environment, not necessarily pointing you in one or another direction. It seems to me that our diathesis stress models, which were pre-molecular, suggested to us that you would always have environmental adversity in conjoined with a particular genetic variant would produce the pathology or the whatever bad thing you wanted. In fact, it seems to me that much of the data is more consistent with the notion that of genotype dependent plasticity, and at the other end, genotype-dependent constraint on plasticity to environment.
That was my question, but I'll make a comment that I think what's really interesting about this from the aging perspective is the extent to which this accumulation of adversity over the life course is leading to what's a typical aging disease outcome, cardiovascular disease, and the extent to which, in some way relating to the other talks, it might shed light on, so who's likely to develop these adaptive patterns of regulation, and who may be really at risk for never being able to acquire those patterns of adaptive emotional aging. And I mean, the studies that I know of, from Laura's lab typically sort of control for socioeconomic status. But I'm wondering, the sample sizes aren't as large as what you're working with. And it may be that some kind of incorporation of these more specific measures that are coming from the laboratory with the kind of larger scale studies that you're working with could begin to shed light on some of those questions.
Okay, we'll have to stop. Thanks, Steve. Our last speaker in this panel is Michael Lamb, You can't stop me from keeping time now, usually. Then we're going to follow this with a half-hour discussion of the topic at large. Michael's talk is called Exploring the Effects of Attachment Relationships on Reactions to Transitions.
Thank you, Bob. I really feel honored to have been invited to this conference. I just wish you hadn't asked me to give a talk, particularly in a session on aging, when for me, anybody older than 8 is usually in the old group in the study. But I want to talk a little bit about some of the ongoing work we've been doing on children's emotional reactions to life transitions. And I took very seriously the admonition that I had to focus on ongoing research and analyses where we were still trying to explain or understand some of our findings. I'm going to start off and spend most of my time talking about the transition to childcare. That is the point at which kids move from being cared for more or less exclusively at home by their parents to spending a considerable amount of time in childcare settings. And we do know from the discussion in the media, as well as countless studies over the last 20 or 30 years, that this transition does have profound effects on children's social and emotional well-being and behavior. Some of that is evident at a gross level in looking at the effects on children's attachments to their mothers. The point of this background, non-data slide, is to show you that if you compare observe children's attachment to their parents twice, and half of those children start childcare in the interim and others do not, you see that the children who start childcare are twice as likely to change the security of attachment to their mothers over this period. So there's a considerable amount of transition taking place, even though, as you see, the proportion of children with secure attachments is exactly the same in those two groups. So you have transitions in both directions. Something is going on. And to explore that in a little more detail, Lilo and I undertook this study where we followed these 70 children over the course of this transition to childcare. These were German children living in and around Berlin. There were multiple assessments at home before they started childcare, so we could assess the security of their attachments. We could look at baseline levels of their physiological reactivity, and then there were intensive observations during the period when they were adapting to childcare, and then in the period after that. Quickly emphasize that in the German system, quite unlike the Anglo-Saxon system that we're all used to, parents are expected to stay with their children for several days around the time that children start making the adaptation. So we have observations during this period when the moms were still with their babies, as well as during the periods after that. Assessments of attachment to mothers were conducted before and after this period, and there were measures of attachments to the care providers later on in the process. And you'll be happy to know I'm going to talk about only very limited portions of this huge data set. As any parent who's ever taken a child to childcare knows, once children start the process of adaptation to childcare, you see very high increases in the expression of negative emotions, and then over time, those levels of a negative emotion start to decrease, so that after they've been going for a while, parents and care providers all agree that she's adjusted, everything's fine. Part of our goal in this study was to see whether there were physiological correlates to some of these changes, which would allow us to explore in a little more detail some of the individual differences in these processes. One of the sets of measures had to do with salivary cortisol, and as you see in this slide, the levels of cortisol over the first hour in childcare increased quite dramatically in the early days of this transition, but that by later on in the process, you were not seeing dramatic increases over that portion of time. The big question, of course, is, well, what happens after the first hour? What's happening to salivary cortisol levels in children who are spending a long period of time in childcare? Megan Gunnar and her colleagues have done many studies focused on this question, and these data are summarized in this slide taken from one of her reports. The crucial thing to notice here is that in all of these studies, the younger children, that is, even the children as old as 5 or 6, don't show the usual diurnal decline in cortisol. In fact, for the very youngest children, you see dramatically higher levels of cortisol later in the day. And that has been interpreted by many researchers as a risk factor. And there's considerable evidence that people, especially little people, who experience chronic high levels of stress and cortisol are at some significant risk. Interestingly, in the more recent studies that we've done in Germany, we don't find the same pattern. And you'll see in this slide, which compares the children's cortisol levels across 3 days of the week, 2 of them days when they're in childcare and 1 when they're at home, you see in these German kids, you have more or less the same appropriate diurnal variation. Big difference is at quality of care. The earlier studies conducted by Megan were conducted in American daycare centers. These data were gathered in German centers. Having high quality care does make a dramatic difference to children's experiences. It does reduce the level of stress, and as you can see, it is associated with lower levels of cortisol. So one of the factors that accounts for variations in how stressful this transition is has to do with the quality of care provided by care providers in settings. We've tried in this study and are still trying to understand other sources of variation in these children's reactions, and I'm going to present 2 parts of one data slide that explore that in a little bit of detail. The first issue was where we looked at cardiac reactivity in these children and related it to the security of attachments to their mothers. The measure used here is respiratory sinus arrhythmia, since our collaborator was Steve Porges. The key thing to notice or to understand is that RSA is a measure of adaptational control, and so higher levels of RSA are better. They show less levels of distress. And what you can see in this slide is that during the adaptation period, the children who were securely attached to their mothers had higher levels of RSA, suggesting that they were less distressed than the insecurely attached infants. You'll notice that that effect carries over into the first day that the children were left alone by their mothers, and then the differences disappear, so that there are actually no significant differences between the 2 groups after that first period. So the effect of having a secure attachment to mom is something that, at least at this level, seemed to wash out. I was very excited by finding this because I thought, well, maybe what this is telling us is that these children are starting to form meaningful relationships to care providers, and that we're going to find that actually it's the security of attachment to care providers that comes in and starts to be important at this point. In this, the second part of my data slide, you see the focus on comparing attachment to both mothers and care providers. So secure means secure to mother, secure to care provider, and so on, and these different patterns. These data, I think, don't show that the formation of secure attachment to care providers really explained what happened. This is my as yet uninterpretable slide. I don't see here the sorts of findings that I was hoping to find in relation to the role of care providers in helping these children adjust. On the other hand, it's clear that the mothers and sensitivity and involvement in these children's lives did have an enduring effect on the process of adaptation and on the children's emotional regulation more generally. And I want to show you briefly just a little slide that illustrates this effect. The key variable here is looking at the comparisons between before and after ratings of attachment security to mothers. And what you see here is that attachments to mothers either stayed secure or became secure the longer the mothers stayed helping the children make the adaptation to childcare. So the more time children had getting introduced to the situation in the presence of the mothers, the better they were able to function in that relationship. So attachment security did have some effects, though as yet hasn't shown to have the same sorts of effects that we had hoped to look at. In addition to trying to make sense of this huge body of data, we've now started a couple of studies that look at other sorts of transitions. The transition to school, which for many children in Britain takes place obscenely young, at the age of 4. We have a comparison group of children in Germany who start closer to the age of 6. So we have quite wide variations in the nature of these transitions. And then are also looking at what's a particularly interesting transition that takes place in adolescence for British children when they go from secondary school to sixth form colleges. And it's a transitional point on the way to tertiary education. And our hope is to see comparable processes of emotional factors and particularly attachment relationships helping to explain how children make these transitions. And if I've totally confused you, here's an email address to which you can send your questions that you don't ask me now.
We have time to review those questions now, so. Yeah.
Yes.
On the slide where you were looking by days of the week, I was wondering if the very first data point was significantly different when they first wake up. The levels of cortisol.
This one?
Yeah. Is that a significant difference in the morning, the first measurement?
You see it's highest on the Fridays and lowest. Yes, there is a significance between the Friday and Sunday, but not the others.
So it's very interesting. Are they actually on a weekly rhythm where they know this? You know, what the...
I think that's exactly they are. And at the end of the week, you've had this cumulative exposure to moderately stressful experiences. So your levels are higher at that point going into the day. Yeah. But as you see that they then by mid-morning, you've lost those differences. So it's only at the outset. Yes?
Maybe a really dumb question, but has anybody looked at kids that are homeschooled or stay home and the reliability of the attachment styles in those kids? Is that even possible? Or
homeschooled?
Say some kids don't go to school and you can look at the reliability of the attachment style. I'm just wondering about the reliability.
Well, in some sense you have this here in the bottom category. These are kids who were at home with their moms at the beginning and were still at home at the end. And you see that there's actually a fair amount of transition. You've got about 20% of those kids changing security of attachment across this period, but double that rate in the kids in the other group. Yes?
It's a related and somewhat unrelated question. I'm curious about what your feelings would be about retrospective report, maybe of attachment, and I'm wondering if you have any longitudinal data, say, in adolescents to suggest that they're rating their attachment with their parents as children the same as you rated their attachment or as they rated it at a younger age. And my question is because could I do this with elderly? You know, how good would the retrospective report be? It seems to me like it would be very biased, or at least everybody would be skewed in a positive direction.
Well, you asked that question in the right building, but of the wrong person. I mean, there are many people here who are studying adult attachment and individuals' constructions of the attachments that they had in earlier life and relating that to measures of the attachments they have with their children and various other indices of psychological adjustment. And I don't know if there's anybody from Mary's lab here who could answer that question better than I could.
I can speak to it with respect to the Midas data set because we've been looking at the constructions or reconstructions that people make of their family environments based on their age now. And what we find is that age really does not moderate the reconstruct. There's no general change in the affective tone or the frequency of people who report unpleasant childhoods or abuse in childhood. Now, the oldest people in Midas, I think, are 77. Is that right? Must be. Yeah. So there does not appear to be systematic distortion on reports of childhood offense.
We're at the end of Michael's question period, so let me thank Michael for his talk. We can transition, that's a good transition point into the next general discussion. So I heard in this panel really 4 general themes. These are really topics: emotions, attachments, environment, and genes. And we have really 3 questions to apply as a group. One is sort of, and maybe this is the place to start, what's next? I mean, what do we really want to know? If some administration dumped a couple of $1 billion into this research area, how would we want to see it spent? I think I'd like to start with that question, and then we'll transition into what's the implication for this in terms of how people live their lives successfully as they age. So I think the discussion that Shelley was getting us into in terms of attachment and age is really the beginning of this. Based on what you heard, we'll start with our sort of immediate panel. What's the most important things that we need to know, and are there obstacles to our knowing them? Are there basic pieces of knowledge that are going to help us understand how older people, as we age, how this interplay between genes and environments plays out in these realms of our emotional lives and our social attachments. How was that, Brian? Pretty integrative?
Excellent.
Laura, Laura, you kind of started this out, so maybe it would be okay to ask you first in terms of...
I can spend that money, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and then how would you spend that money? How would you establish your bona fides as a spender of the money?
I mean, I think of all of this in terms of adaptation. And ultimately, what we would like to be able to do as psychologists, right, is to be able to improve functioning across the life course. I think some of what we've learned about aging actually will help us inform improving younger people's lives, because some of the things they do seem to have positive benefits that younger people aren't getting for whatever reasons.
Younger people to live the lives of younger people, or
to live the lives of younger people,
so that they'll be better older people when they get there?
Well, so I mean, the way I would think of this as adaptation is people want to create lives where they're not overly stressed in some chronic way, where they're able to achieve goals and have successful relationships. I mean, that's if I was going to say in broad strokes what people are trying to do throughout life. So in some cases, I think older people seem to be on to some strategies that seem to be useful for emotional well-being. As I said earlier, I don't think prioritizing well-being over other kinds of goals throughout life, I think, is a really bad idea, and it's a bad idea for old people. So some of what we're learning are under what conditions do you see these effects, and what conditions don't you see these effects? When does it work and when doesn't it work? I think is useful. I mean, I think sometimes people approach this as, oh, unreliable. It's not here. It's not there. It's like we've got to find a story that's coherent across, that can put all of these different pieces together. So I mean, that's what I would want to do. I would want to understand adaptation, and then the big, the big win would be being able to change people who aren't doing well.
Yeah, Liz and I were talking about this at dinner last night, and that is that the data. I mean, a lot of the people in this panel have contributed to it. Present a pretty good picture of age at the group level. Right. In this realm, unlike cognition and your ability to dance and juggle, people are doing pretty well. But the variability, the variation is still significant, and that's in all these areas. And so, we can say that everything's okay because the group isn't doing as bad emotionally as we might have thought. Or we can say, well, let's look at that variability and talk about the people who aren't doing as well. And then Liz pointed out that she didn't think it was a good idea to take people who are doing super well and making them worse. But
we are making progress in this area, and what Derek's findings about executive control. I mean, I think what we've identified actually is a way of aging that is very good. And in general, people are on that trajectory that looks good. But as you say, there's lots of variability around it. And now we're starting to say high levels of executive function. I mean, this is what Mara has shown, predicts that. So then you might want to target that. What is that related to education? Is that related, so that, if people have the control cognitively, socially to achieve goals, then it looks good. If they don't, if goals change and you can't get them anyway, it sounds pretty miserable.
Howie, you want to chime in?
I guess one of the things as I was listening, it seems like, correct me if I'm wrong, the field really hasn't settled yet on what really represents a deficiency that's coming with aging versus what is representing an adaptation that's healthy and that's volitional.
I'm sorry, I think we're getting to it. Mm-hmm. That, again, but it's what I just said. I mean, if people have, if cognitive abilities are relatively well preserved, not look like young adults, but look relatively well preserved, it looks like older adults do really well. And it's not because it's not a serendipitous consequence of something going wrong, which I think is often the explanation that people apply. It's just, well, people can't get aroused anymore. Or people are looking at positive information because they're not so complex. And so it's the village idiot kind of model of successful aging, and so you can't, that's not true. We know that's not true now. So I think that's a step forward.
Let's see, I'm sort of keeping track of hands.
I think that we should keep our eye on the ball of what leads to good physical health. By the time you get older and have the shift in time perspective, you are already on a pretty good trajectory of when you're going to die. So there's this association between this, better emotion regulation and, physical health, where you're at then in health behaviors. So we've got to keep our eye on health behaviors. Health behaviors are boring. No one wants to study them. But, what really sets people off on good health behaviors early in life, it is time perspective. I think part of it is you need to think about, I think it comes down to certain things like temperament and who gets hooked on exercise. But so if we think about what are the mediators of this shift, this healthy adaptation when you're older, you've talked about this time shift, but is that the crucial element? Are there other mediators that we can induce in younger people besides kind of imminent vulnerability and death and mortality? And what are the moderators of this adaptation? So the long allele is obviously one of the few really big chunks of variance we've identified, but there's got to be, other important ones. Executive functioning and development of that when you're young is probably huge, and I think that Laura's paper on personality and attention when you're young and later health is huge. And my last point is, sorry to be so long-winded, but this whole the social emotional selection theory, the present orientedness, the shift in priorities, the savoring life, there's just this huge parallel in the stress field of there's this question of who's vulnerable and who's resilient to stress and why, and we don't know why, and what are the moderators. But it's not just traumatic, it's the stress-related growth and benefit finding, that whole field of people do show growth and adaptation through trauma and stress. And maybe it's more the life-threatening, but also just traumatic experiences can cause these shifts. So what, again, in that field, this happens to people throughout life. What are the moderators of this healthy adaptation?
I don't want to keep dominating this, but if I can, because there are a couple, the time perspective changes gradually. So you see significant differences between people from early adulthood to middle adulthood. It's a linear change. It's not the, oh, I'm going to die, now you suddenly see a time perspective shift. And the goals also follow that kind of pattern. But there's also a lot of evidence, some from our lab, you say the same kinds of shifts when people are about to graduate from college. You see the same kinds of shifts with endings as when they're going to move across the country geographically. It's not just death, it's endings. But death represents kind of the ultimate. So.
I wanted to ask a follow-up question. Originally I was going to ask it of Steve, but I'm going to ask it of you too, Alyssa. How far are we away from taking a genotype like like the long variant of SERD versus the short, and saying that people should plan their lives differently? So if they have indications early on of this heightened sensitivity to changing environments or relative insensitivity, and that's just one, are we anywhere near the point where we would then make recommendations as to, the kinds of things that they could embrace and avoid, and make that part of thinking about how we live our lives, so that we optimize, we play the hand that's been dealt us genetically in a way that minimizes our clogging of our arteries and maximizes our happiness.
Can I just jump in before Steve says something and add?
Is that because you don't want to hear what he wants to say?
No, I want to hear. I want to hear what he says to this too. What about changing the genotype?
Well, let's put that off for a second.
Okay.
And let's come.
I mean,
that's a little more complicated.
We have this knowledge.
Yeah.
Anyway. I want to jump into
Nobody
but I just want to say that there's a tendency in a lot of the psychological work to focus on changing the individual to make the individual more adaptive, and I'd like to open the discussion to the potential for informing changes in the environment, the daycare environment, the socioeconomic,
for those who are going to
the census tract and so forth. So I think that's a worthwhile perspective.
All right, let's get into it. What do you have to say?
My bet is it's premature. Take for example ApoE, polymorphism, probably this the strongest genetic predictor we have for dementia. That's not absolutely dictated genetically, and the ethical consensus now is that even with the degree of predictability that has, it ought to play no role in judgment making. I kind of think different.
Can you speak up?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, I think the general judgment would be right now we don't have any genetic variation, even in areas where we have much stronger and replicable effects. I mean, 200 studies or so for ApoE and onset of Alzheimer's, but it's still not considered to be sufficiently predictive to pass along the information to map one's life around. But I think that it may be more interesting ultimately to know the genotype, only to know the kind of who might target best for certain kinds of behavioral interventions. For example, we find that the other sort of poster boy for molecular genetics, monoamine oxidase A, which interacts with early adversity to predict violence. We find that MOA variation, the low activity allele, does predict lifetime histories of aggressive conduct in men, but it only does it in people who hold attitudes that justify or give warrant to the exploitation of others. And those attitudes we find in a twin study have no heritability. So basically, it's, you know, in absent sort of this attitudinal justification for that sort of behavior, there's no association between the genotype and the outcome. So I would say it'd be, you know, it's probably more tractable to deal with whatever is the you know, social learning that you know, the affects the acquisition of those sort of you know, displacers than to try to attack the underlying neurobiology. And finally, I would just say the relationship between the genetic variation and the functional neurobiology is very far from understood. In fact, for many of these, including the transporter, you know, we don't know how much of the action had to do with the laying down of the structure of the nervous system early in development, and what we're seeing now is sort of a palimpsest, just the, you know, the pass-through of an altered system, which is now, you know, being manifest differently in adulthood. But
I've
the
never
action
heard
may have been
anyone use palimpsest in a discussion of genetics, but that's great.
I learned it, remember?
We used to talk about it.
Yeah.
So, but it seems to me like the other side of this is, and it's not just in this discussion of genotypes that we think are risky, but are we as a field afraid to pull the trigger from our data, some of it correlational, but a lot of it experimental, to move forward and apply it in these ways that, you know, might actually have some benefits? And if we are afraid to pull the trigger, why is that? I mean, is there a risk? Is there a risk that we're avoiding, or is it are we just not taking our work seriously enough? Because, you know, we've been doing this for a long time, and we've been saying that we were going to pull the trigger, and you know, and other people are pulling the trigger based on much worse information. So why aren't we trigger happy as a? You know,
So I'm not sure that we need to be trigger happy, because we know what good environments are, and good environments benefit everybody. They may selectively benefit people with particular genetic risks, but it's not the case that certain kinds of environments help some people and not others. We honestly don't need to take the genetic background into effect for many of the recommendations that we might want to make. I mean, the notion of try to get a lot of stress out of your life, make sure you have good friends, take the time to spend time with them. All of those are recommendations that are good for everybody. They might be especially good for SSs on the serotonin transporter gene, or for people with the G allele of the mu opioid receptor, or for, you know, I mean, there are a number of, or for MAOA low efficiency individuals, but that doesn't change the fact that the recommendation really applies to everybody.
But if we have limited resources, can we, you know, and we can't change all environments, should we change the environments for those who we have reason to think are at risk because they're insecurely attached, because they have poor emotion regulation, or because they have a particular set of genes that we think are going to make them particularly sensitive to harsh environments?
I mean, I would argue that in some ways we can be part of the debate about how to change how we think about applying limited resources. And if we think about life course perspectives on a lot of these questions, we're talking about establishing the socio-emotional regulatory abilities and the executive function abilities at an early stage that sets the stage for developing in a positive way and learning to manage your health behaviors and those sorts of things. So, you know, the cost of going in and fixing what's broken in someone who had a low SES and short allele start to life at a later stage in their life may be far greater than investing in things earlier on. And I think, I mean, just want to re-emphasize that's one of the reasons why we think a life course perspective on these very specific aging outcome questions is so critical, because resources are limited. And if we want to look at where the interventions are going to be most effective, we want to be sure we're targeting the most effective critical stages. Not to say that we don't care about people who are old now, but...
Do we know enough to say if you have a particular genetic profile or you are low SES or something like this, that you could compensate for that by exercise, for example? I mean, could we make that kind of a prediction? Because it may be that, even I completely agree that, you know, what's good for people, for humans, is across the board. It's not specific, but for humans who find themselves in a low socioeconomic status, it's not okay, you know, say, well, you should have been in a high one. You know, I mean, so you know, better. Or in my case, I mean, people always say stress. You know, you shouldn't have so much stress in your life. And I think, well, then I wouldn't be me. You know, I'd have to give up my entire life. But could I exercise? Like, could I know something about? But do you know the answer to that? Like when you were saying that these things covariate. Oh, you know the answer.
I've been looking at that.
So can you?
So yeah. I'm actually, there's some preliminary data showing that the relationship between stress and predicting later on insulin resistance can be buffered, or financial stress at an earlier age can be buffered by exercise at that earlier age.
But not a later age?
Well, the exercise at the year 25 is buffering the effect of financial stress on insulin resistance 15 years later. So, and in some of our daily data, I'm showing that in high ruminators, the exercise is breaking that rumination negative affect cycle. So, and we're going to be publishing it hopefully.
That's not an experimental study, right? That's just looking at population.
Yeah, just looking at
So are you ready to pull the trigger on that finding?
Once it gets accepted, yeah.
Laura's been trying to get us.
Sorry, Laura. Yeah.
So, just picking up on some of these points, I mean, I think that research is coming out rapidly that suggests that both germline genetics and epigenetics suggest that the social environment really interacts with the biology, and so that you know, different people have different vulnerabilities and so forth, but that the social environment clearly has a pretty big impact. And so I think the tricky thing about studying underlying biology is sort of thinking about what can we do with it? You know, when do we pull the trigger? And when I've thought about it, I think about it in terms of things like, it's going to give us some insight into, you know, how these things happen, which is going to tell us something about, say, sensitive periods. So is there a particular time when something happens that it really matters, that we should really be paying attention to? The childhood stuff is particularly interesting. Is it reversible? Are these effects, did it happen at one point in time, and then if you haven't addressed it, it's really tough to reverse? Or again, is there a sensitive period for reversibility? And then later on down the line, maybe for targeted intervention. So if you kind of missed a certain window, then maybe you can really have some understanding of who's vulnerable and kind of what to do about it. So I don't, you know, the pulling the trigger is sort of depends on kind of, you know, what the question is and when. But I think we shouldn't discard the value of thinking from a much more social perspective in terms of, you know, what kinds of environments do we need to give people? We may not be able to put everybody in high SES, but there may be some things that policies we could put into place that would really alter the environment in a way that would take away some of the more toxic pieces of it. And a related point or sort of thought I had on the last talk was, you know, thinking about, well, it's interesting to see these patterns of cortisol variation and, you know, following that up to see, do those predict any kind of behavioral, adaptational health outcomes later on down the road would be really interesting, again, for trying to get to some of these sensitive and critical periods and how that works, as well as thinking about, what was the other thing I was going to say? It was something about, also, you know, some of the early childhood stuff talks about how it's important to have some level of stress. The kids need to be inoculated. So, you know, Jack Shonkoff talks about kind of this benign stress, or is that benign, or he has some labeling for it. Toxic stress is the really bad stuff. And then there's two other levels. There's like manageable stress, and then there's like, I think it's benign. It's some kind of like, but it's good in the sense that, you know, the kids learn to manage it. You know, no stress would mean they never get any coping skills. So when I was looking at that data, I was thinking, well, gosh, you know, maybe the cortisol levels are not terrible. You know, maybe they're actually going to tell you something like some of those kids are going to adapt really well, and following that out over time would give you some insight into understanding kind of, you know, how do those adaptations track out across time, and are there things you could put into place to moderate the, you know, for the kids who, you know, don't look like they're doing so well early on, that will then change that out. So I think the neurobiology is critical for lots of these questions, but I'm not sure for answering the immediate one, oh, we're going to target this person and we're going to, you know, really get in for that person.
Just to follow up, we may ask Michael. So if you had a kid who, in the separation kind of situation, was really not showing that RSA response that you like to see, the good RSA response, would you consider that a basis for anything, you know, at the level of the individual?
Well, let me answer
You want to answer a different question? Yeah.
Because I think the evidence shows that the kids who have chronically high levels of cortisol are the ones who are showing more behavior problems, acting out, not only as preschoolers, but also once they get into school. So there is some other data suggesting that it's not good to have these chronically high levels. It may be good, as you say, you have to face some kind of challenges, but they have to be challenges you can master so that you also are able to go from those states of arousal and are not constantly challenged and vigilant.
What about the people who are old and in chronically stressful conditions, facing disease or low SES?
Academics.
Yes, academics who are parents of small children. But I'm thinking about some of what we're finding from these more experimental studies about the processes of social interaction and emotion regulation. You know, we've talked about, we know a little bit, but not enough quite about the individual differences in these. What about when people face these serious challenges in older age? How are these, what do we know about how these processes, insofar as their improvements or adaptive, are actually helping them through these kinds of situations? Or what would we need to do? What kinds of studies would we need to have to answer those questions? Maybe addressing three of you who are really doing those experimental
I think we need to
more.
understand much more about what the social consequences actually are. So I think one of the reasons why this field is so fascinating, coming from someone who is used to looking at cognitive aging, is because there are lots of advantages and disadvantages that may be associated in terms of emotions and aging. And I think what we really need to understand are, as Laura's already said, some of these things that look like they may be advantages may actually have some negative consequences as well. And for the people who are struggling with things like, say, emotion perception, might that have an impact on the way that they interact with people in everyday life? Certainly, particularly in dementia, there's lots of evidence that that may well be the case. And so there may be some very specific interventions that might be useful, or there may at least be a lot of use in trying to educate people as to the fact that if you have dementia and you're failing to respond to someone's anger, it may be because you just don't understand it.
And what would you do based on that? Is this a way to
A very basic thing that you might want to do is to be making sure that people who are working and living with people with dementia are educated, understand what's going on, basically, at a very fundamental level.
Yeah, which I think people are quite ignorant of and get quite angry at the failure of people to respond to anger. Very good.
Yeah, I wanted, in answering, also put in a plug for a postdoc of mine who used to work with Fredda and Jenny Stanley, who's presenting on a poster on Saturday looking at this issue of variability, and I think it comes to a perspective on Liz's question. So what Jenny did is she looked at used cluster analysis to look at profiles of mood change and across the task. And there was a group that started pretty positive in a good mood, and their mood got better. There was a group that started very negative at the beginning of the task, and their mood got progressively worse. And then there were two groups in the middle who sort of regressed to a neutral point. And older adults in the sample were overrepresented in the most positive group and also in the most negative group. And the young adult tended to be in the neutral, sort of regress to the mean group. And so, if you just look sort of simply at what we know about these people, it's the usual suspects: the older people who are slow in responding and score high on CESD. They tend to be in the negative group. I mean, it's not that surprising. But what we don't know very much about the older adults and poor regulators, and so it's hard to know, are they people who because of a lifetime have sort of ended up there, and then maybe it's hopeless, not a good target for intervention, or they're people who are facing stressful situations that their previously adaptive regulatory strategies are no longer appropriate for. We just don't know about them. So I think actually, when I think about the older adult as the target of intervention, I think we actually, strangely enough, we need maybe to know more about the people at the bottom end of this particular spectrum.
And they're the people who are very difficult to recruit into our horrible experimental studies where we sit in front of computers for many hours. I think that is a really serious issue, actually. We're not recruiting these people.
And I think that's exactly right. In terms of identity, it's not that all older adults are doing well in that sense. And I think this individual difference approach is critically important at multiple levels of analysis. So what we're looking at in this study that I couldn't go into is the cortisol profile and amylase profile and DHEAS profiles of these individuals who emotion regulate. And so Can we identify different clusters of people doing well and not doing well, and what are they doing? But there was some interesting research. I was just in Germany where they're using brain activation as an individual difference measure in terms of your responsivity to processing negative valence information in the prefrontal cortex, and they've been able to identify older adults that look like younger adults in terms of brain activation, and older adults that look like I don't know what they look like. I guess they look like older adults that are poor regulators. So I think these really innovative techniques of getting at it at different levels of analysis is really necessary right now with respect to identifying that group and what to do about it.
We got a little behind, and I think this is a conversation that can go on quite a bit longer, and but we don't want to get too far behind in the day. So what I want to propose is that we call that the last word, that we take a 20-minute break. We start up again at 10 after 11, so we'll only be 10 minutes behind, and that those of you who still had questions, my apologies, that you ask, that you grab the people up. And remember, when you come back, you will be sitting somewhere else.
Speakers will be relocated. The next